Set. Good evening, and welcome back. Somewhere in the driest place on Earth, in a basin so harsh that almost nothing survives, archaeologists pulled something out of the sand that science didn't quite know what to do with. Mummies, hundreds of them preserved so well you could see their eyelashes, the weave of their clothing, the color of their hair. That alone would be remarkable. But what made these bodies genuinely unsettling wasn't how they looked, it was where they were found. Deep inside China, in a region most people couldn't point to on a map, in graves that didn't match anything around them. And then the DNA results came back. No known population on Earth was a clean match. Think about what that actually means for a second. We live in an age where genetic databases cover thousands of populations across every continent. Scientists can trace a single person's ancestry back through dozens of generations, pinpoint migrations, connect dots across tens of thousands of years. The tools are extraordinarily precise. So when those tools look at a group of ancient people and come back uncertain, that's not a rounding error, that's a signal. That's the data telling you something genuinely strange is going on. These weren't isolated skeletons buried in ambiguous circumstances. There were cemeteries, there were artifacts set. There were infants buried next to adults, grave goods, symbolic objects, evidence of a community with rituals and beliefs. People who knew each other, buried each other, mourned each other, a real society, real lives, leaving behind real evidence. And yet, when researchers tried to slot them neatly into the known story of human migration across Asia, they didn't fit, not cleanly, not the way you'd expect. The region in question is the Taran Basin, in what is now Western China. One of the most forbidding landscapes on the planet. The Taklamakan Desert sits at its center, and the name, depending on who you ask, roughly translates to you, "Go in, you don't come out." It is an enormous bowl of sand, surrounded by mountain ranges, cut off from rain, baked by summer heat, frozen in winter. It should be the last place you'd expect to find a thriving ancient community. And yet there they were, century after century, generation after generation, living at the edges of oases, leaving behind an archaeological record that researchers are still working to fully understand. The time frame stretches roughly from around 4,000 years ago. Though some of the material is older, and some considerably later, Bronze Age people by rough categorization. But labels like that can flatten complexity, and in this case, the complexity is the entire point. Set. What this video is going to walk through piece by piece is how these mummies were discovered, what they actually looked like up close, what their graves contained, what the genetic evidence does and doesn't say, and why this story has attracted so much attention. Some of it scientific, some of it deeply political. Because ancient DNA has a way of becoming a flashpoint. Who these people were matters to living people today, and that creates pressure on the interpretation of evidence in ways that are worth understanding. There is a lot of mythology around the tar mummies, a lot of headlines that reached far beyond what the science actually supports. By the end of this, you'll know how to separate the real mystery, which is genuinely compelling, from the noise surrounding it. But before we go any further, I want to know where you are right now. What time is it where you're listening? Drop it in the comments. I check them, and it's always this strange, wonderful thing. Someone in Mumbai at dawn, someone in Toronto at midnight, all of us gathering around the same story from completely different corners of the planet. Tell me where you are. Now, let's go back to the desert. Here's the thing about mummies, set. Most people's mental image is Egyptian priests with linen strips, Coptic jars, intricate rituals designed specifically to cheat death, to outmaneuver decomposition through human intervention. That image is accurate for Egypt, but it's also a very specific solution to a very specific problem. It assumes that without intervention, the body will rot. What happens in the Taran Basin is something fundamentally different, something the desert does entirely on its own, without any help, without any ceremony designed for that purpose. And in some ways, it's more impressive. To understand why, you need to understand what decomposition actually requires: bacteria, moisture, warmth. Give organic tissue those three things in the right proportions, and it will break down completely within weeks, sometimes days. Remove any one of them aggressively enough, and you can stop that process cold. The Tin Basin removes two of those factors so completely, it almost seems intentional. The Taklamakan Desert receives less than 10 millimeters of rainfall per year in most areas. To put that in context, the Sahara, which most people consider the gold standard for brutal dryness, receives about 25 millimeters in its driest zones. The Takan makes the Sahara look damp. The air is so desiccated that moisture is pulled out of organic material almost immediately after burial. Skin tightens against bone. Tissue contracts and hardens. The biological machinery of decay never gets the moisture it needs to operate. But that's only part of the story. The soil beneath much of the Turin Basin is heavily alkaline, loaded with salt. And salt is one of nature's most aggressive desiccants. Bodies buried in saline soil don't just dry out. They're actively drawn dry by the chemistry of the earth around them. Salt pulls fluid through tissue the way a sponge pulls water across a table. The combination of bone-dry air above and salts-saturated soil below creates a preservation environment that can stop decomposition faster than almost any other natural setting on the planet. Then add the temperature swings. Summers in the Taran Basin can exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Winters can drop to -20. That kind of cycling doesn't help preservation in itself, but it does something useful. It keeps the entire environment inhospitable to the microbial communities that would otherwise colonize and consume buried organic matter. Extreme environments, by definition, support fewer organisms. The desert isn't just dry, it's almost sterile. What comes out of this soil under the right conditions isn't a skeleton, it's a person. Skin intact, sometimes still showing pigment and texture, hair preserved, color and curl and length maintained. Fingernails, eyelashes, the soft tissue of the face, recognizable as a face. Internal organs in some cases still present. Clothing still draped across the body in the position it was placed. This is natural mummification, not as a rare accident, but as the predictable outcome of an extraordinarily specific set of environmental conditions working in concert. Now, when archaeologists pull one of these bodies from the earth and begin to assess it, they're reading a kind of layered document. The skin tells them about the desiccation process, how fast it happened, whether it was uniform across the body. The hair tells them something else entirely. Hair is chemically stubborn. It resists change and it preserves color and structure in ways that bone doesn't. Several of the tomb mummies have hair ranging from orange to light brown to what some researchers have described as blonde, which is one of the details that set off decades of speculation and eventually controversy. The textiles are another chapter in that document. Wool, felt woven patterns, some of them technically sophisticated, all of it preserved by the same dryness that kept the body intact. You can examine the fibers under magnification, identify the animal species the wool came from, analyze the dye compounds, study the weaving technique. A single piece of fabric from a tar burial can carry more information than a paragraph of written text. The burial conditions themselves add context. Orientation of the body, what was placed around it, beneath it, over it, whether the grave was lined, marked, enclosed. Each of those choices, assuming they were choices and not accidents, reflects something about what the living believed was owed to the dead. But here's the complication, and it's a significant one. Extraordinary physical preservation is not the same as extraordinary cultural context. The tar mummies are remarkably well preserved as physical objects. As documents of culture, the record is much patchier. Some burials are rich with artifacts and clear spatial organization. Others are stripped bare, ambiguous, difficult to interpret. The desert preserved the bodies with almost uncanny fidelity. But it didn't preserve everything equally. Wooden objects survive. Textiles survive. Organic materials that would have disintegrated anywhere else are still here. But the things that would tell you the most, language, belief, social structure, origin stories, those don't fossilize. They never did. You have to infer them from the objects left behind. An inference has limits. That asymmetry is one of the defining tensions of Taram research. Researchers are working with evidence that is physically spectacular, but interpretively incomplete. The bodies tell you what these people looked like. The artifacts tell you something about how they lived. The genetics, when the analysis finally became possible, told you something about where they might have come from. But none of those data sources speak directly. They all require interpretation. An interpretation, especially around questions of identity and origin and belonging, is never neutral. What the desert preserved is extraordinary. What it withheld is just as important to understand. The first finds weren't dramatic. They rarely are in archaeology. No single expedition arrived with cameras rolling and pulled a perfectly preserved ancient human from the sand on cue. The Taran mummies came to light the way most significant archaeological discoveries do, gradually, unevenly through a combination of accident, persistence, and the slow accumulation of evidence across decades. Local people in the region had known about strange things in the desert for generations. Farmers digging irrigation channels near oasis towns. Herders moving across terrain that dried wind had carved and reshuffled. People living close to the land notice when erosion exposes something that shouldn't be there. Bones, fabric, wood, objects that look different from what the desert normally produces. Word of these finds circulated locally long before any formal scientific apparatus existed to receive them. What exactly was reported, what was preserved, what was rearied, sold, or simply left in place, most of that is gone now. But the pattern matters. The desert had been yielding these objects for a long time before anyone with academic credentials arrived to document them. The first systematic attention came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the period when European powers were sending expeditions into Central Asia with the specific goal of finding antiquities. Names like Svenhan and Aurel Stein are well known in the history of exploration. They moved through the Taran Basin and surrounding regions, documented ruins, collected artifacts, and shipped significant quantities of material back to institutions in Europe. Their methods, by modern standards, were not careful. They were explorers in the colonial mold, operating under assumptions about ownership and access that would be considered unacceptable today and were already contested at the time. But they also produced records, descriptions, photographs, sketches of sites that in some cases no longer exist in any recognizable form. That archive, problematic as its origins are, became part of the foundation for everything that followed. The more systematic archaeological work began in the mid-20th century and accelerated significantly after the 1970s and especially through the 1980s and 1990s. Chinese and international surveys working across the Xinjiang region began cataloging sites with greater rigor, applying the stratigraphic methods and documentation standards that separate archaeology from treasure hunting. And what those surveys kept turning up again and again was burial sites. Not just any burial sites, sites where the dead had been extraordinarily preserved, where everything the desert had decided to keep was still there waiting. What made these burials stand out to investigators wasn't just the mummies themselves, though that was obviously striking. It was the whole context. A properly excavated burial doesn't just give you a body, it gives you a relationship between objects, where something was placed relative to something else, carries meaning. Whether a wooden vessel was positioned at the head or the feet, whether textile wrappings were layered in a specific sequence, whether grave goods showed signs of use before burial or appeared to be made specifically for the dead. None of that information survives careless excavation. It has to be recorded in situ layer by layer, position noted before anything is moved. The sites where documentation was done carefully yielded an entirely different quality of information than the sites that were rushed, looted, or disturbed before formal work could begin. Several sites and cemeteries became particularly central to how researchers understood the broader phenomenon. Kavrul, sometimes called Kumagu, near Lopnor in the eastern Tarim, produced some of the earliest and most discussed mummies, including one individual given the nickname the Beauty of Lulan by journalists. Though researchers have sometimes been less enthusiastic about that kind of labeling for reasons we'll get to. Zagonluk near Church yielded remarkably well-preserved individuals, including a tall man with reddish-brown hair, and a series of associated burials that showed consistent material patterns across multiple interred individuals. The CI Cemetery, also known as Cemetery 5, sits on a dried riverbed and contains hundreds of burials arranged in a distinctive pattern with tall wooden posts marking grave locations, a feature so unusual it prompted years of debate about what it signified. These sites are not exhaustive. They're focal points, places where enough careful work was done and enough material recovered that they became anchors for the larger discussion. And here is where it gets complicated, because the story of how these sites came to be known isn't a clean narrative of scientific progress. Access to the sites and to the mummies themselves was restricted for significant periods. The political geography of Xinjiang is not simple, and it never has been. Foreign researchers who wanted to study the material faced bureaucratic barriers, permit denials, delays that stretched into years. Some early investigations were conducted under conditions that made proper documentation nearly impossible. Objects were removed without complete records. Photographs were taken, but not always shared. Different researchers working from different institutional contexts sometimes came back with accounts of the same sites that were difficult to reconcile. The controversies around early handling weren't purely political. Some of them were straightforwardly methodological. Radiocarbon dating requires careful sample selection and chain of custody. Textile analysis requires knowing exactly where a piece of fabric was found relative to the body it accompanied. When that provenance information is incomplete, it limits what you can conclude. Some of the most interesting artifacts from the region carry uncertain histories, which means the conclusions built on them carry uncertainty too. There's also the problem of what the initial frame of interpretation was. Early investigators looking at these mummies were working within certain assumptions about who could have been in Central Asia at that time and what that presence would mean. Those assumptions shaped what questions got asked and which details got emphasized. The light hair, the tall stature, the presence of certain textile techniques. Each of those details got filtered through an existing set of ideas about migration and ancestry and cultural diffusion. Ideas that were not always well-grounded and were sometimes motivated by something other than curiosity about the past. The mummies were in the ground for thousands of years before anyone came looking. What happened in the first decades after people started looking shaped the entire subsequent debate in ways that are still being untangled now. When people first see photographs of the tar mummies, the reaction is almost always about the faces. The desert did something here that almost never happens. It didn't just leave skeletons. It left people who still look like people, skin drawn tight but intact, eyelashes clinging to lids, braids of hair lying exactly where a living hand put them 3,500 years ago. That kind of preservation is rare enough that it can override caution. You look at a face that seems familiar, and the impulse is immediate. They look like us, or they look like them, someone, some group, some story you already know. The bodies that came out of Kevhal and Xiao and Zagonluk fed that impulse hard. Descriptions in excavation reports and later publications are remarkably consistent on certain points. Many individuals have hair that is still clearly visible, sometimes even still styled. It ranges in color from dark brown to light brown, with a substantial number reported as reddish brown or chestnut. A few have been described in popular accounts as blonde, though under laboratory lighting and after careful cleaning, those shades often resolve into sun-faded brown. The hair is usually straight or wavy, sometimes braided in complex patterns, sometimes wrapped in felt caps or woolen hats. Facial features are what grab the headlines. Some of the most famous mummies have narrow noses with high bridges, relatively deep-set eyes, and fine, sharply defined cheekbones. Journalists in the 1980s and 1990s seized on those traits as European-looking, a phrase that migrated into book titles and museum labels, and then into a huge amount of speculative writing online. The beauty of Lulan, church and man, the beauty of Shawai. These nicknames didn't come from the communities that buried them. They were imposed later based on what modern observers thought they were seeing in the preserved faces. Height contributed to the effect. Osteological measurements suggest that many of the adult males were relatively tall for their time and region, often in the range of 170 to 180 centimeters and sometimes above, with some females reaching heights that would still be considered moderate to tall in many populations today. Combined with the preserved clothing, tailored garments, fitted trousers, patterned textiles, the impression is of striking, even imposing individuals frozen midlife by the desert. But stop the story there, and you get a distorted picture, because not all of them looked like the handful of famous photographs that circulate most widely. Even within the best-known cemeteries, there is visible variation. Not every skull has the same narrow hybrid nose. Some faces present broader nasal apertures. Mandibles differ in robustness. Cranial vaults have slightly different shapes. Some individuals are stockier, some more gracile. Hair color varies not just between cemeteries, but within single burial grounds. One grave might contain a man with reddish-brown hair and another just a few meters away in the same stratigraphic layer. A woman with dark brown or nearly black hair, her features less easily slotted into any single modern racial category. Age adds another layer. These cemeteries are not collections of idealized adults. Infants and children are present, sometimes bundled in layers of textile and fur, sometimes placed in special containers. Elderly individuals are there too, with worn teeth, osteoarthritic joints, and vertebrae that tell of years of labor. A population is not a single face. It is a statistical cloud of bodies, each reflecting a slightly different path through life, and that life is written on the soft tissue as much as on the bones. The preservation quality in many tar burials is extraordinary. The environment, cold, dry, salty with rapid desiccation, and limited microbial activity, essentially converted these bodies into natural freeze-dried specimens. Skin remains shrunken, but identifiable. In some cases, internal organs left faint traces. Soft tissue preservation allows for the identification of features like ear shape, lip thickness, even the pattern of facial muscles. It also preserves scars, lesions, and in some instances, evidence of disease. Teeth are especially informative. Archaeologists and bioanthropologists examining dentition from these cemeteries have noted patterns of wear that speak to diet and behavior. Horizontal wear on murs suggests heavy reliance on coarse gritty foods, likely grains ground on stone, incorporating tiny particles of sand and stone dust. Enamel hyperplasias, those faint horizontal lines or pits in the teeth, rester episodes of physiological stress during childhood, periods when growth was interrupted by illness or malnutrition. They tell you that life here, despite the rich textiles and elaborate burial practices, included hard years. Bones corroborate that story. Long bones show the stress of repetitive labor. Muscle attachment sites that are overdeveloped in ways consistent with heavy lifting, grinding, riding, or long-distance walking. Some individuals have healed fractures, broken ribs, long bone breaks, vertebral compression that knit back together in patterns, suggesting they survived substantial injuries and lived on for years. Others show spinal changes associated with carrying loads or riding animals for long periods. Joints tell you who spent decades working with their hands or squatting in particular positions. This is the anatomy of a working population, not a curated set of elites. There are also signs of disease. Some skulls and long bones show lesions consistent with chronic infections or inflammatory conditions. Dental caries indicate carbohydrate-rich diets. Abscesses mark where teeth failed and infections set in. In certain cases, calcified parasite eggs or other biological traces and associated materials hint at gastrointestinal burdens. These people weren't just tall figures in colorful clothing. They were bodies dealing with the same messy biological realities that affect humans everywhere. Parasites, injury, nutritional stress, all of which raises a critical point. How much can you really infer about ancestry from how a 3,000-year-old partially desiccated face happens to look? Human eyes are pattern-seeking machines. Most of us trained consciously or not to associate certain facial features with modern categories like European, East Asian, Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and so on. But those categories are products of recent history, recent politics, and recent patterns of migration. Freezing a face in time and then reading it through a modern lens can be deeply misleading. Skin color, which many people treat as a primary ancestry signal, is almost entirely gone as an informative trait here. Whatever pigmentation these individuals had in life has been transformed by desiccation, oxidation, and salt. Mummified skin darkens. It desaturates. It equalizes differences. You're not seeing the living complexion. You're seeing thousands of years of chemistry. Hair color, which seems more straightforward, is also treacherous. Pigments break down unevenly over time. Sun exposure bleaches hair, especially at the surface. Chemical changes in the burial environment can lighten or re-set. A person who had medium brown hair in life can present as reddish-brown or even yellowish in death. Without biochemical analysis, eyeballing a lock of ancient hair and deciding it proves some particular ancestry is risky at best. Facial soft tissue offers no easy answers either. Much of what we perceive as European or Asian in a face involves soft tissue thickness and distribution. Cartilage, fat pads, muscle tone, features that are altered dramatically by dehydration. Miffication pulls tissues tight, distorts lips, flattens cheeks, and can change the relationship between nose and face. Even small differences in how a body dried out can produce big differences in how we interpret its look. Then there is the issue of sampling bias. The most photogenic, well-preserved, and striking mummies are the ones that appear on book covers, in museum brochures, and in news articles. Those images create an archetype in the public mind. The tall, light-haired, hybrid-nosed tar mummy that is then retroactively applied to the entire assemblage. But when you look at full site reports and catalogues, you see something else. Variation. Skulls that don't match the stereotype. Bodies that are shorter, broader, different in subtle but important ways. Cemeteries whose average cranial measurements differ from others. This isn't a single homogeneous type stamped across 1,000 years. This variation matters. It opens up possibilities. Long-term local continuity, multiple incoming groups, or some blend of both. It undermines simplistic stories that these people must have come from one distant place because a few faces remind modern viewers of one modern population. It also complicates attempts to read political narratives into ancient bone structure. Bioarchaeologists try to short-circuit those biases by turning to metrics. Cranial measurements taken systematically and compared across populations can reveal patterns of affinity and difference. Dental morphology, the shapes and frequencies of particular tooth traits, tends to be highly heritable and less affected by environment, making it a useful line of evidence for population history. Age-at-death profiles reconstructed from tooth eruption, epithelial fusion, and bone degeneration provide demographic information. How many died young? How many reached old age? Whether certain cemeteries skewed toward particular age groups. Pathology patterns reveal not just individual misfortune, but community conditions, which diseases circulated, how nutrition fluctuated, who was protected, and who was not. Even so, bones and teeth, like faces and hair, are only parts of the picture. They tell you about bodies, where they might sit in relation to other bodies on a broad human map, how they lived, what stresses they endured, etc. They do not by themselves tell you who these people were in cultural terms. What languages they spoke, what stories they told, how they understood themselves in relation to their neighbors. And that is the question that has driven so much of the debate. Were the people of the Taran Basin an intrusive group that marched in from far away, or a local population developing its own distinct way of life in a harsh environment, or some composite of many streams of ancestry braided together over centuries? To even start answering that, you have to step beyond the bodies themselves. You have to look at what they wore, what they were buried with, and what material traces of their daily lives survived beside them. Because whatever their genetic roots, whoever their closest biological relatives might have been, the culture they built in this desert left its own clear signatures, the clothing, the tools, the objects laid carefully at their sides. That's where the next layer of the mystery begins. Clothing is usually the first clue that these people do not fit neatly into anyone's story. The Terran mummies are not wrapped in generic shrouds. They are dressed, layered, tailored. In some cases, the sewing is so fine that you can follow the line of a hem the way you'd trace a sentence. Many of the burials include woolen textiles of astonishing quality for their age. Under magnification, those fabrics resolve into specific weaves, plain tabby, balanced, and tight twill with its neat diagonal ribs, even complex patterned bands where colors alternate in a deliberate sequence. The yarn itself tells a story. It is spun to a consistent thickness, Z-wisted or est-wisted in systematic ways, which means someone knew what they were doing and had learned it from someone else who had learned it from someone before that. Some garments are cut and sewn, like fitted tunics. There are tailored jackets with set-in sleeves. There are trousers with carefully shaped legs and gussets that make them comfortable for riding. Not just loose tubes of cloth, but pieces cut to allow someone to straddle a horse or a camel for hours. Waistbands are reinforced. Hems are finished so they won't fray easily. In some cases, decorative elements are woven into the fabric itself. Stripes, checks, contrasting borders. These are not improvised rags. They're clothes made by people who understood patterning, fit, and the demands of life in a cold, dry basin. Felt appears everywhere. Hats, caps, and conical headdresses made from densely compacted wool fibers. Boots and shoes with felt uppers, sometimes combined with leather soles, padding, and liners. Felt is efficient technology in a place like this. Warm, wind-resistant, relatively easy to shape once you know the trick of matting wool under heat, moisture, and pressure. Its presence in so many graves suggests a community that had mastered sheep herding, wool production, and textile craft to a level that could sustain variation and specialization. That variation turns out to be important because it gives archaeologists something to compare. If you take a fragment of twill from a tar grave and place it beside a fragment of twill from a Bronze Age site in what is now Kazakhstan or the Altai or the Iranian plateau, you can ask, are these techniques the same? Are the yarn diameters similar? Are the twist directions and loom tensions comparable? Does the dye palette match? In the Taran Basin, some of the earliest wool textiles show a repertoire that looks to many researchers remarkably Western Eurasian in style. Certain twill patterns, particular color combinations, even the use of plaid-like checks that recall fabrics from much farther west. Later layers introduce new motifs, new cuts, perhaps reflecting changing fashions or new influences. The temptation is to look at a checked woolen cloak and say, this must have come with immigrants from the steppes, or from Europe, or from some other named region. But archaeologists have to be more careful than that. Cloth doesn't have a passport set. A weaving technique can travel with a person who moves, but it can also travel with a trader, or with a bride, or with a stolen garment that someone takes apart and copies. You can learn a method without inheriting genes from the people who invented it. So when specialists line up textile samples from the Tarim against those from Andovo sites, in the steppe or bacteria Margana complexes to the southwest or early Chinese sites to the east, they're not simply looking for matches. They're asking what kind of contact would be required for these similarities to exist. Is it direct? Did someone from one of those regions actually live and weave in the Terran Basin, or is it indirect? Did a finished cloth travel down a chain of exchanges, get copied locally, and then become its own tradition here? The same logic applies to other things in the graves. Take the distinctive wooden markers in the Xiaowai and related cemeteries. Some are long upright poles carved into shapes that have been compared to oars, paddles, or stylized human forms. Others are board-like planks placed above or near graves. They're not functional tools for daily life. They're symbolic objects, part of a burial language particular to this region. Nothing quite like them has been found in contemporaneous cemeteries far to the west or east, at least not in any systematic way. That uniqueness has led some scholars to argue for strong local development. Whatever genetic or cultural inputs flowed into this basin, the people buried here were creating their own distinct mortuary code. Then there are the baskets. Woven red or willow containers accompany many burials, sometimes still holding grains, seeds, or other offerings. The weaving techniques resemble basketry traditions across a huge swath of Eurasia. Simple twining, coiling, plaiting. You could find broadly similar baskets in Neolithic Europe, the Near East, Central Asia, or early China. Basketry is one of those human universals that can converge independently, but details matter. The way a rim is finished, the specific plant species used, the shape standard in one community, but not another. In the trim sites, some baskets are finely made with complex patterns, others more utilitarian. Their contents, wheat, barley, millet in some cases, add another comparative dimension. Certain crops, like wheat and barley, were domesticated originally in Southwest Asia and spread east. Others, like millet, were domesticated farther east and spread west. Finding them together in the same graves, in baskets that look at once familiar and locally adapted, hints at a crossroads where multiple agricultural traditions met. Leather is yet another layer. Shoes, belts, straps, sometimes entire garments are cut from tanned hides. Stitching styles, hole spacing, and seam types can be compared with leather work from surrounding zones. Some tar shoes and boots bear a striking resemblance to footwear, known from steppe nomad cultures. Soft leather uppers turn soles, sometimes reinforced at the toe. Others are simpler, more like moccasins. The presence of both suggests a mix of practical solutions to the problem of walking and riding in a desert that turns searingly hot by day and bitterly cold by night. Felt cloaks, woolen leggings, leather belts, red baskets, carved wooden posts, sometimes even small wooden figurines or models. Taken together, this suite of artifacts is what archaeologists call material culture. It's the physical residue of a way of life, and it speaks a language of its own. That language, though, is nuanced. It can tell you where ideas have probably traveled. It can suggest zones of influence, spheres of interaction, converging traditions. What it cannot do on its own is prove that whole populations picked up and marched into the Terran Basin in one big migratory wave. This is where different scholars part ways. One camp emphasizes the apparent Western affinities of some early textiles and tools. They point to the tailored woolen garments, twill fabrics, and certain metal objects as part of a broader steppe package associated with Mobile, pastoralists, stretching from the Urals through Kazakhstan and down into Xinjiang. In this view, at least some of the people in these early Tarim cemeteries are seen as intrusive, descendants of groups who moved eastward from the steppe, bringing with them sheep, horses, wool weaving, and their particular styles of dress and gear. Another camp pushes back. Yes, they say there are similarities, but the Tyrium assemblages are not copies. The wooden burial markers, the specific cemetery layouts, the blend of crops, the particular combinations of felt, leather, and wool. These look like local innovations built on a foundation of long-term occupation. Techniques may have filtered in from multiple directions, but the way they're put together is distinctive. This interpretation leans toward continuity. People already living in or near the basin adopt and adapt ideas from neighbors, gradually building a unique desert culture. Between these poles sits a more synthetic view that many researchers quietly favor. Neither pure migration nor pure isolation, but a braided stream. In this scenario, the tar basin is a magnet. Small groups from different directions arrive over centuries. Herders from the northwest, farmers from the east, traders from the southwest. They encounter resident communities who already understand the basin's harsh rhythms. Cloth patterns, basket styles, burial rites, and tool types blend, clash, and recombine. Over generations, the graves reflect a composite material language. You can still hear echoes of distant traditions in the weave of a tunic or the shape of a boot, but the overall sentence is being written locally. Whatever position you take, the method is the same. You line up artifacts from different places and times. You note commonalities and differences. You build networks of similarity. This dye recipe here, that weaving pattern there, this style of felt hat shared between two regions, but absent in a third. You map those networks onto what you know about ecology and travel routes. Rivers, passes, oases, and grasslands form the channels through which people, goods, and ideas are most likely to have moved. Crucially, these material networks can exist even when gene flow is limited. A trader might carry a cloth 1,000 kilometers and sell it to someone whose ancestors never left their valley. A bride might bring her basket weaving technique into a new family without bringing a large chunk of outside ancestry. An itinerant artisan might teach a new way of making felt and then move on. The genetic footprint of such contacts can be faint. The cultural footprint can be bold. That distinction matters a lot when we turn back to the breathless claim that the DNA of some mummies matched no known population on Earth, because it sets up an apparent contradiction. Artifacts whose style whispers of the steppe, the Near East, and early China, wrapped around bodies whose genomes at first pass seem to form their own cluster. Does that mean our eyes and the comparative typologies archaeologists use have been fooling us? Does it mean we've overestimated the degree of contact? Or does it mean something else? That genes and objects can tell different but overlapping stories? Those are the questions that drive the next round of debate. To pursue them, we have to leave the grave goods in place for a moment and step back to look at the cemeteries as a whole. How they're laid out, how symbols repeat across graves, how the architecture of death encodes identity and connection. Because clothing and tools tell you how people lived, cemeteries tell you how they wanted their lives and their origins to be remembered. If you zoom out from the stitched seams and basket rims and look at the ground plan of these sites, a different kind of pattern appears. The Shao Cemetery, one of the most famous, does not sprawl at random. It's a long, narrow strip of burials laid out along an ancient dune ridge, like a spine of sand and bone. Graves are dug in rows, but the rows aren't neat grids the way you might see in a modern cemetery. They undulate with the terrain. Some plots cluster more tightly, others stand slightly apart, as if the community was negotiating space not just with the landscape, but with invisible lines of belonging. Orientation is one of the first things archaeologists check. In many Chia graves, bodies lie supine, head and feet, carefully aligned along a dominant axis. The majority appear to follow a consistent orientation relative to the local topography and the path of the now vanished river, rather than some universal cardinal direction. That consistency suggests rule, not accident. Even if we don't know what the rule meant, we can see that there was one. Then you notice the pairings. A number of graves are arranged in pairs or small groups positioned side by side or end to end. Sometimes an adult and a child share a tight cluster of markers. Elsewhere, two adults of similar age are placed with matching grave goods. Genetic studies where DNA has survived suggest some of these pairs are close relatives, parent and child, siblings, perhaps spouses, but not all. Some grouped burials show no obvious first-degree kinship at all. That matters because it tells you that biology was only part of how this community defined who belongs with whom. Some people are buried close together because they were family in the genetic sense. Others seem to be linked by something else: social role, alliance, ritual partnership, or a kinship category that doesn't map neatly onto our modern terms. Above ground, the first thing that would have struck you if you walked into Zi 3,500 years ago would not have been the bodies. It would have been the forest of poles. Tall wooden posts, some rising several meters, sprout from the sand over many graves. Their shapes vary. A common type is long and tapered like an oar or paddle stuck blade down into the dune. Others are flattened boards with rounded tops. A few are carved more explicitly with suggestions of shoulders or heads edging towards stylized human figures without quite becoming statues. Patterns emerge when you plot them. Certain pole shapes show up almost exclusively with burials identified as biologically male, others with biologically female graves. Some have been interpreted as phallic, others as more abstract, even boat-like. In some graves, especially at Sia, women's burials are marked with what look like symbolic wooden vulvas, small carved pieces set near the pelvis or upper thighs. Men's graves may have long upright poles at the head end, sometimes wrapped with reed or cloth bindings. The associations are not perfectly consistent, but they are strong enough that most researchers agree these are not random pieces of timber. They are gendered markers, or at least markers that track with the way this society classified bodies. Even infants and children are pulled into this symbolic system. Tiny graves can have miniature versions of the same markers or simpler boards, echoing the shapes above adult burials. That suggests children were not outside the social order. They were inscribed into it from the moment of death, perhaps even from birth. This is where interpretation starts to outrun certainty. It is tempting, and some popular accounts do this, to call Shawar a boat cemetery, to imagine that the dead were being launched into some mythic river under a row of upright oars. It's easy to see the long paddles and think of journeys, of psychopes, of ships, of the dead. It's equally tempting to look at the explicitly sexual carvings and declare this a fertility cult or a society obsessed with reproduction. Maybe some of that is right, maybe none of it is. What we can say with confidence is narrower. The people who built these cemeteries invested enormous labor in making visible distinctions between categories of the dead. They cared about aligning body and marker, about repeating certain combinations of grave goods with certain post types. They did this over generations as the cemetery expanded along the dune. That kind of pattern behavior usually rests on a shared set of stories about why the world is the way it is and what happens after you leave it. In other words, myth, ritual, cosmology. Beyond Zia, other Tarim cemeteries show the same urge to pattern, but with different dialects. At Gumugu, another early site to the north, graves are set in shallow pits lined with wooden planks. Some burials feature concentric arrangements of poles and stakes, like the ribs of a dismantled structure laid flat around the corpse. Here too, archaeologists have found enigmatic carved objects, wooden masks sometimes placed over the faces of the dead with exaggerated features and drilled eye holes. The masks introduce another layer of symbolism. Was the dead person being given a new face for the next world? Was the mask representing an ancestor, a spirit, a social identity? Farther west, in cemeteries associated with slightly later, more clearly step groups, you start seeing different arrangements again. Stone curbs around graves, low mounds, ringed enclosures, set. Some bodies are laid out with the heads oriented toward particular mountain passes, or river mouths, as if anchored to the geography that define their seasonal movements. Across this range of sites, though, a few themes repeat. One is the separation of the dead into distinct zones. Cemeteries are not usually set smack in the middle of habitation areas. They're placed on ridges at the margins of oases, along ancient shorelines, threshold zones between water and desert, between cultivated land and open steppe. These lineal placements echo practices across much of ancient Eurasia, where burial grounds often occupy edges, the outskirts of settlements, the tops of hills, the banks of rivers. Another is the use of vertical markers to make graves visible from a distance. Whether it's a wooden pole, a stone slab, or a heap of rocks, the effect is the same. The cemetery becomes a landmark, a place you can point to across the plain. In mobile or semi-mobile societies, that kind of visibility is crucial. It lets people return to the same burial ground generation after generation, even as their camps move. It turns the dead into a fixed anchor in a shifting landscape. That, in turn, has social implications. A cemetery with dozens or hundreds of marked graves is a claim. It says, "Our people are here, have been here, will continue to be here." In steppe cultures to the north and west, Large current fields serve the same function. They map lineages onto geography. Our ancestors lie along this river. Therefore, this pasture is ours. The Tarim cemeteries may have played a similar role, staking genealogical and territorial claims in a harsh environment where access to water and pasture could mean survival. Burial patterns inside the cemeteries can also hint at social distinctions. Some tar graves are richer than others. A few individuals are buried with especially fine textiles, multiple garments, elaborate hats, and a full suite of grave goods, baskets, wooden containers, tools, ornaments. Others, perhaps in the same row, have simpler outfits and fewer offerings. There are subtle differences in coffin construction, in the quality of the poles or planks used as markers, in the presence or absence of special objects like masks or figurines. It would be easy to read this as straightforward social hierarchy, elites and commoners. Maybe that's partly true, but status in small-scale societies can take many forms. Ritual specialists, skilled herders, lineage elders, individuals with particular personal histories, etc. Without written records, we can't tell whether a richly furnished burial marks a political leader, a shaman, or simply someone whose relatives had more resources when they died. Kinship is encoded too, but again, not in a way that yields simple answers. At some sites, genetic studies suggest that people buried in tight clusters tend to be related through the maternal line more than the paternal, or vice versa. That might indicate maternal or paternal descent patterns where lineage is traced through mothers or fathers. Yet, grave layout doesn't always match strict genealogical trees. You see interleave someone with no close DNA ties buried right among a cluster of relatives, perhaps an unmarried spouse, a fostered child, an adopted member of cow. The tangle matters for the broader mystery of who these people were. If you come in expecting a neat imported social system from the steppe, you might look for classic steppe mortuary signatures, pronounced warrior graves, weapon-rich burials, elite chirons. Some sites have elements of that, bronze weapons, horse gear, but the overall mortuary language is different. The wooden fertility symbols, the masks, the boat-like coffins, the dune-top alignments, these do not map cleanly onto any single external template. At the same time, you can't say they developed in total isolation. The use of grave goods, like weapons, mirrors, beads, and spinning tools, reflects broader Eurasian norms about equipping the dead. The basic idea that how you are buried should echo how you lived, gendered tasks, age roles, craft skills, is widespread from the Black Sea to the Yellow River. The Trinum people are speaking in their own mortuary dialect, but the grammar is recognizable. That ambiguity is exactly where interpretation gets dangerous. Scholars and journalists alike have projected all kinds of narratives onto these cemeteries. Lost Indo-European tribes, Proto-Carians, mysterious temple cults, even visitors from some vanished civilization. The striking visual drama of Ziai's poles and masks makes it especially vulnerable to that kind of storytelling. It looks like a message, and we want to read it. But a message without a key can mislead as much as it illuminates. Symbolic systems are notoriously hard to decode without texts or living informants. The same object can carry multiple meanings depending on context. A carved wooden phallus might be about fertility, or about lineage, or about cosmic order. A boat-shaped coffin might reference a journey, or a myth about creation, or a memory of real migrations long past. We can propose models, compare with other cultures, test for consistency. We cannot at this distance hear the stories the Meras actually told as they set those posts, fastened those masks, and walked away from the fresh graves. Still, the cemeteries give us something important: structure. They show us that these people ordered their dead according to rules that were stable enough to persist for centuries. They show us that gender mattered, that kinship mattered, that certain symbolic pairings, this pole with this garment, this mask with this coffin, mattered. They tie the Tarim communities into wider Eurasian patterns of edge-placed burial grounds, visible ancestral monuments, and grave goods that mirror daily life, while also highlighting local inventions that have no clear parallel. When you line that up with the clothing, the baskets, the leather work, you get a picture of a society that is not an outpost of someone else's culture, but a node in a larger web. Ideas and practices are flowing in along trade routes and herding circuits. They are being reworked, recombined, and fixed into the desert through these cemeteries. And yet, under all the patented sand, the bodies themselves tell a somewhat different tale. To get at that, we have to leave the poles and planks standing in our minds and follow the scientists who drilled into bones and teeth, counting atoms to find ages and later sequences in DNA. Because if grave layouts tell us how the living thought the dead should be remembered, chronologies and genomes can tell us when these communities flourished and how or whether they were connected to anyone else on Earth. When archaeologists say this mummy is 3,800 years old, it sounds clean and authoritative, like reading a date off a tag. In reality, that number is the endpoint of a long chain of assumptions, measurements, and corrections. Change one link, and the age can jump by centuries. Most of what we know about when the Terran mummies lived comes from radiocarbon dating, which, despite the mystique, rests on a simple principle. Everything alive is a tiny bit radioactive. While a plant is photosynthesizing, while an animal is eating that plant while you're breathing, your body is constantly taking in carbon from the atmosphere. Most of that carbon is the stable isotope carbon-12, but a small fraction created high in the atmosphere by cosmic rays is carbon-14, which is unstable. It decays. As long as you're alive, intake and decay stay roughly in balance. When you die, the intake stops. The carbon-14 in your tissues keeps ticking down at a known rate, like a chemical hourglass. Measure how much carbon-14 is left compared to how much you'd expect in a living thing, and you can estimate how long the hourglass has been running. For organic materials up to about 50,000 years old, that gives you a powerful clock. But here's the catch. Radiocarbon dating doesn't give you the date on a calendar. It gives you a radiocarbon age, which then has to be translated into calendar years. That's where context and complication come in. Start with the material itself. In a terminal grave, you might have a human femur, a scrap of wool from a robe, a wooden coffin plank, a reed mat or rope, bits of charcoal from a funeral fire. If you date all of these, you will almost certainly get slightly different answers. They're not all telling you the same thing. A bone date, assuming it's well preserved and uncontaminated, is usually taken as a proxy for when that person died. The collagen in bone turns over during life and then locks in at death. Date that, and you're roughly dating the burial event. Textiles are different. Wool comes from sheep that lived and died before the person did. The cloth might have been woven years before it was placed in the grave, patched, dyed, handed down. A radiocarbon date on that wool tells you when the sheep lived, not when the mourner placed the robe around the corpse. It gives you a no later than sealing. The burial can't be older than the cloth, but it can be younger. Wood is trickier still. A coffin plank might be cut from the heartwood of an old tree. That heartwood stopped exchanging carbon with the environment decades, even centuries before the tree was felled. So a date on that plank can be old wood. It reflects when that part of the tree formed, not when it was chopped, carved, and lowered into the grave. In a region where timber is scarce and reused, that offset can be large. The burial event, the moment when bodies, clothes, coffins, and offerings all came together, is not something you can stick in a machine. You have to triangulate it from all these different samples, each with its own offset. This is why archaeologists obsess over context. It matters whether that wool fragment came from the cloak, wrapped tightly around the mummy, or from loose debris, blown into the grave centuries later. It matters whether the charcoal you're dating was clearly from a burning on top of the coffin or from a hearth dug into the cemetery long after it was first used. Without careful excavation and recording, the numbers quickly become meaningless. Now add another layer. The atmosphere itself doesn't stay constant. The amount of carbon-14 in the air has fluctuated over time because of changes in Earth's magnetic field, solar activity, and even human behavior in the last few centuries. That means a measured radiocarbon age of, say, 3,500 years before present does not always map neatly to 500 BCE on a calendar. Sometimes the relationship between radiocarbon years and calendar years is smooth. Sometimes it's bumpy with plateaus where several calendar dates produce almost identical radiocarbon signatures. To deal with this, scientists build calibration curves. They take things we can date independently in calendar years, tree rings, corals, varied lake sediments, and measure their radiocarbon content. Plot enough of these, and you get a curve that lets you convert a raw carbon age into one or more possible calendar date, ranges each with a probability attached. When you see a date in a paper like 2200 to 2000 BCE, 95% probability, that's what's going on. There's not a single magic number. It's a statistical window calibrated against a constantly improving curve. Every time those calibration curves are updated, and they are, as more high-precision tree ring sequences and other records come in, old carbon results can shift. Not because the mummies are changing age, but because our yardstick is being redrawn more finely. Then there's contamination. Tar basin preservation is spectacular, but that also means materials have been exposed to the air, to groundwater, to conservation chemicals used by early excavators. Modern carbon can creep into organic samples in the form of glues, consolidants, hand oils, even cigarette smoke from decades ago. A tiny amount of recent carbon can make an ancient sample appear younger than it really is. The reverse can happen too. If you're not careful about removing carbonates or humic acids from soil and water that infiltrated the grave, you can skew dates older or scatter them across a wide range. Different labs use different pretreatment protocols. Improvements in those protocols have already led to some tarim dates being revised. All of that means that when you try to date the term mummies, you're not looking at a single clean sequence. You're looking at overlapping clouds of probability. Even so, some broad contours have emerged. The earliest well-dated burials in this desert tradition appear to cluster in the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium. BCE sites like Gumugu and the earliest phases of Shire give calibrated dates somewhere around 2000 to 800 BCE, with some samples nudging a bit earlier or later, depending on which material you look at and which calibration curve is applied. As you move forward along the sequence of cemeteries and grave rows, you encounter later phases, additional layers at Xiaoi, other nearby dune cemeteries, and then a spread of sites around different oases. These show dates extending through the 2nd millennium BCE and into the early 1st. By the time you get to some of the more clearly steppe-influenced cemeteries with bronze weapons, horse gear, and textile styles that echo cultures to the north and west, you're well into the 1st millennium BCE, overlapping with the early historical Silk Road. So when people talk about tarim mummies, they're often collapsing more than 1,000 years of burials into a single mental image. The iconic beauty of Shaowai, with her reddish hair and felt hat, likely lived around the early 2nd millennium BCE. Other famously publicized mummies, like the so-called churchman with his tall felt boots and colorful textiles, belong to later centuries. They were not contemporaries. They may not even have spoken mutually intelligible languages. Yet in popular accounts, they are flattened into one mysterious population, frozen in an eternal Bronze Age present. From the perspective of migration and genetics, that flattening is dangerous. If you assume all these mummies belong to a single wave of settlers, you might be tempted to look for one dramatic origin story. A lost tribe marching in from the west, or an isolated offshoot of some vanished Central Asian people taking refuge in the basin. The radiocarbon evidence suggests something more complex. An early phase of occupation, probably by groups with their own internal diversity, followed by centuries of continuity, change, and likely influx from surrounding regions. New dates can tighten or loosen these phases. For instance, if additional well-controlled samples from the deepest graves at Xiao consistently calibrate earlier than our current earliest dates, that might push the beginning of this tradition back, closer to the time when certain steppe cultures were just forming. That in turn would affect models of how and when ideas, crops, and people could have moved across the mountains into the basin. If, on the other hand, improved pretreatment and calibration push some of the supposedly earliest tar burials later by a century or two, that changes which external cultures they can plausibly be interacting with. Suddenly parallels that once seemed too late, like certain textile patterns from Western China or Kazakhstan, fall into a tighter chronological alignment. Contact becomes easier to imagine. The same applies at the later end. If some of the richly furnished, more globalized Tim graves turn out to be younger than previously thought once contamination is stripped away, they might overlap more strongly with historically recorded movements. Early Indo-Iranian speakers, Chinese expansion into the northwest, or known nomadic confederacies. That would change how we frame both the DNA evidence and the cultural comparisons. And this is where the dates and the genetics start to intertwine. Ancient DNA gives you a snapshot of ancestry at the level of individuals and small groups. Radiocarbon dates tell you when those individuals lived relative to each other and to events elsewhere. Without a reasonably secure timeline, a genetic signal that looks like mixed ancestry could represent a community that was always mixed, or a population that remained isolated for centuries and then suddenly absorbed newcomers. Shift the dates by a few hundred years, and your story of isolation versus interaction can flip. This is one reason you'll see cautious geneticists insisting on fresh carbon dates from the exact bones they're sequencing, rather than relying on older textile or wood dates from the same cemetery. They're trying to anchor each genome in time as securely as possible before drawing big conclusions about migrations or lost populations. In the Taran Basin, that process is very much ongoing. Every new sample drilled, every new calibration curve published has the potential to nudge the timeline of these mummies forward or backward to tighten, or widen the windows in which contact with the steppe, with early Chinese states, or with other Central Asian cultures was possible. So when you hear that the earliest harem mummies date to around 2000 BCE CE, treat that as an approximation, not a fixed point on a wool chart. It's a best estimate built from a mosaic of bone collagen, sheep's wool, desert timber, and statistical curves. As that mosaic is refined, the stories we tell about who these people were, where they came from, and how they fit into the broader human picture will change. And in the next part of this story, when we step away from clocks made of carbon and look at the lives those dates bracket, the foods they ate, the herds they managed, the routes they walked across that parched landscape, you'll see why even a shift of a couple of centuries can turn one migration theory from plausible to impossible, and why building a good timeline is not just a technical exercise, but the foundation for understanding a society that once clung to the edges of a desert sea. Imagine waking up in that world we've just dated in rough outline. You don't know it's around 1800 BCE. You don't know that people thousands of years in the future will call you a tar mummy. You just know that if the river shrinks another few meters this summer, your children might not make it through winter. Life in the Taran Basin wasn't just life in a desert. It was life on the knife edge between water and nothing. Those famous cemeteries, Shao, Gumagu, the dune burials with boat-shaped coffins and upstanding poles, aren't sitting in lush oases today. They're in parched, salt-crusted wasteland. But when these people lived, there was water nearby. Not a wide blue lake with palm trees, but a shifting, fickle ribbon of river flow. Snowmelt fed from distant mountains, wandering across its own floodplain over decades and centuries. Your entire economic system revolves around that water. If the channel runs closed this year, you can dig short canals or shallow wells. You can flood small fields, encourage reeds, maybe even coax a patch of millet or wheat out of the dusty soil. If the channel wanders away, you pull back, drive your animals further, and pray the next flood season pushes it back in your direction. Archaeologists reconstruct this kind of daily balancing act from scraps, pollen grains trapped in sediments, seeds charred in ancient hearths, the bones of animals butchered and thrown away in the Tarim. Those scraps are unusually well preserved, which means we can sketch a plausible menu. Millet and wheat show up early in the region, crops that originally evolved far away. Millet in North China, wheat in Southwest Asia, and somehow made their way into this inland basin. Their presence in graves and settlement layer suggests at least small-scale farming. Not endless green fields, but garden-sized plots along moist ground, patches of grain to grind into porridge or flatbread, insurance against a bad hunting season. Alongside the crops, there are the animals. The textiles on the mummies are mostly wool. That alone tells you sheep were central. Sheep, and probably goats, are your walking pantry. Meat, milk, felt, hides, sinew. Their manure fertilizes your little fields. Their bodies clothe you against bitter desert nights. Cattle and horses appear later and more patchy, but sheep bones and wool are everywhere. Then there's hunting and gathering. Even in an oasis-based life, wild resources matter. Antelope, wild donkeys, hares, water birds along river channels, fish where pools linger after floods, reeds, and other wetland plants for mats, rope, basketry, wild fruits and nuts in the foothills. If you're willing to travel, you can see this mix farm, herd, hunt etched into the chemistry of their skeletons. When scientists talk about dietary isotopes, they're doing something surprisingly intimate, reading a life's worth of meals from the atoms inside a bone. Different foods have slightly different ratios of stable isotopes, forms of elements that don't decay. Plants using different photosynthetic pathways. Animals grazing at different altitudes or on different vegetation, even freshwater fish versus terrestrial meat, all leave distinctive signatures. By measuring carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone collagen, researchers can estimate relative reliance on animal protein versus plants, or distinguish between diets heavy in millet versus wheat and barley, Oxygen-strontium isotopes in teeth can hint at where the water and rocks of your childhood home were, which ties diet to mobility. Dental wear tells its own story. These mummies often have heavily aridated teeth, the enamel ground down by years of chewing gritty stone-dusted grain and fibrous plants. In some cases, microscopic analysis of the scratches and pits on tooth surfaces reveals patterns consistent with coarse cereals and meat, not the smooth way you'd see from a diet of mostly soft-cooked foods. Plant residues caught between teeth, tiny starch grains, phytoliths made of silica can sometimes be extracted and identified under a microscope. You can literally find bits of millet or wheat lodged in tartar that hardened on someone's mers 3,500 years ago. Put those lines of evidence together, and the picture that emerges is not a band of pure steppe herders or pure farmers. It's a blended economy here, about herding sheep and goats, cultivating little riverine plots, hunting and fishing when and where you can. Flexibility is the survival strategy. That flexibility extends to mobility. Were these people roaming widely with their flocks or rooted at one oasis season after season? The answer seems to be both, depending on the group and the moment in time. Some sites look like they belong to communities that moved seasonally. The pattern of animal bones, the types of plants present, the light footprint of domestic structures suggest temporary camps keyed to grazing cycles and water availability. In such a world, your year might be a loop. Winter in the shelter of low dunes near the river, spring up toward the foothills as snowmelt greens the steppe. Late summer back down to harvest whatever grain survived. Autumn butchering and drying meat before the cold sets in. Other contexts, especially near later, larger oases, look more settled, more permanent architecture, thicker cultural deposits, evidence for orchards, and longer-term field systems in some tar oases centuries after the earliest mummies. In these cases, people in their dead would be anchored to relatively stable water sources, only sending herders out in smaller groups. Isotope studies help untangle this. Teeth form during childhood and don't remodel. Bones turn over more slowly throughout life. If the strontium or oxygen signatures in teeth differ from those in the surrounding region's geology and water, but bone signatures match the local environment, that suggests an individual who grew up elsewhere and moved in as an adult. If both teeth and bones match local values, you're likely looking at a lifelong resident. Preliminary isotopic work in and around the term suggest a mix. Some individuals with local signatures generation after generation. Others whose childhoods trace to different parts of the basin or even beyond its rim. That fits the idea of oasis communities as semi-permanent nodes plugged into wider seasonal circuits. None of this was easy on the body. The same skeletons that tell us what these people ate also tell us what it cost them. Healed fractures hint at falls from horses, tumbles on uneven ground, accidents with livestock. Compressed vertebrae and worn joints point to years of carrying loads, grinding grain, working hides, digging irrigation channels. Some bodies show clear signs of violent trauma, sharp force injuries from blades or points, blunt force to the skull. Others bear no obvious wounds, but the cumulative effect of chronic stress is still visible. Nutritional markers paint a picture of intermittent scarcity. Enamel hyperplasias, horizontal lines or pits in the teeth formed when growth was temporarily disrupted, are common. Each one records a childhood crisis, a severe illness, a season of hunger, a bad winter. Many individuals have multiple such markers stacked on their teeth, like notches carved by repeated hardship. Bone chemistry and morphology sometimes suggest periods of anemia, possibly from iron-poor diets, parasites, or repeated infections. In some mummies, you see stunted long bones or asymmetries indicating growth under stress. Even in a body wrapped in fine woolens, the skeleton underneath may carry the unmistakable signs of a life lived on the margin. Disease leaves its signature too, though more subtly. Inflammation scars on bones can indicate chronic infections. Changes in the spine and ribs may relate to respiratory issues. Not surprising in a world of wind-blown dust and smoke-filled winter shelters. Dental abscesses, cavities, and lost teeth speak to pain that could last for years with no relief beyond home remedies. And yet, some skeletons show evidence of long-term healing. Badly broken bones that knit back together, meaning someone with a serious injury was cared for long enough to recover. Older individuals with severe wear who still made it into their 50s or beyond a respectable age in that context. For all the harshness, there was social support, knowledge of herbal treatments, perhaps even spiritual frameworks that helped people make sense of suffering. All of these details, what they ate, how they moved, the injuries they carried, aren't just personal stories. They help explain why certain groups could survive and keep surviving in a place as unforgiving as the Taran Basin. A mixed economy of herring, small-scale farming, and hunting meant you weren't betting everything on one resource that could fail. If the river shifted and fields dried out, you still had your flocks. If disease hit the herds, wild game and stored grain might bridge the gap. If a drought reduced pastures, reeds, and wetland plants from a shrinking but still flowing channel could keep people alive. Mobility added another layer of resilience. Being able to shift camp, change pastures, or send part of the community to a different oasis in lean years reduced the risk of being trapped in a dying landscape. At the same time, maintaining some fixed points, cemeteries, ritual sites, core settlements created continuity, a sense of belonging that bound people together through those moves. Socially, caring for injured and sick members, sharing food within extended kin networks, and perhaps maintaining alliances with neighboring groups would all have increased the odds that any one bad year didn't mean extinction. The very cemeteries we study, structured, symbol-laden, used over generations, suggest strong traditions and group identities capable of holding people together. In a desert where rivers wander, dunes march, and climate can swing between slightly less awful and truly catastrophic, that combination of economic flexibility, physical mobility, and social cohesion is what lets a tradition persist for centuries, which sets the stage for something else. Because once you have small communities eking out a living at scattered oases, moving herds along predictable routes, trading wool, grain, and dried meat, you have more than just survival. You have the skeleton of a network, a chain of habitable dots across an otherwise empty map. Later ages would call that network the Silk Road. But long before silk caravans and imperial envoys, these edge-of-the-oasis societies were already walking, bargaining, and marrying their way between waterholes, turning a hostile basin into a corridor. And when we talk about the tar mummies as mysterious, it's partly because that early invisible stage of connection is hard to see and incredibly important. In the next part, we'll follow those routes outward and forward in time and ask what it meant for this harsh desert to become a crossroads long before history bothered to write its name down. When people hear Silk Road, they picture camel caravans and Chinese silk bolts and imperial envoys with seals and scrolls. Chronologies get tidy. The Silk Road opens, trade blooms, cultures connect. Reality, as usual, is messier. By the time anyone carved that phrase into a history book, people had already been moving things, stones, seeds, animals, stories across Eurasia for thousands of years. No customs posts, no official caravans survey, just overlapping paths, seasonal tracks, and a chain of people who knew where the next drinkable water was. The Taran Basin sat right in the middle of that older, quieter system. Look again at that loop your imagined year might follow. Winter low in the basin, spring up toward the foothills, maybe even onto the open steppe beyond, then back down toward the river in late summer. Now extend that loop just a bit further. North of the Tim, beyond the desert, salt flats and dunes, you hit the grass seas of the inner Asian steppe. South and west mountain walls, the Tianan, the Pamir, the Kun. These aren't impossible barriers. They're filters threaded with passes and high valleys where snowmelt feeds summer pastures. Those corridors mattered long before the Silk Road had a name. If you're herding sheep and goats in the Tarim, summer grass is everything. Up on the Piedmont and in the lower mountain slopes, grass stays green longer. Maybe your group or your neighbors have rights to certain routes. A particular valley in the Tianan, a favored spring in the Kungland foothills. You go there every year. So do people from the other side of the ridge. You don't suddenly become traders when you meet them. You're just doing what pastoralists do. Checking in, sizing up each other's flocks, gossiping about who married whom, and whether the snows were heavy last winter. But every time you do that, stuff moves. A stone tool made from a kind of CH that only crops up in one valley shows up 2 valleys over. A new style of harnessing a horse, if you have horses yet, spreads with the people who've tried it and like it. A few seeds of a different grain hitchhike in your food bags. Over centuries, that kind of drip-feed exchange adds up to something huge. Archaeologists sometimes call this the Old World Exchange Belt. Long before there was a Silk Road proper, a vast, loose web connected farmers, herders, and foragers from the Mediterranean to northern China, not with direct contact spanning continents, but with chains of near neighbors, each handing off new things to the next. The term sits at one of the knots where those chains cross. You can see it in the textiles. Those famous wool garments on the mummies, twills, plaids, complex weaves, aren't random improvisations. Their techniques look strikingly similar to fabrics found much further west in Bronze Age steppe and European contexts, not identical, but part of the same broad textile tradition. Loom-woven wool, specific styles of twill patterns that require a particular understanding of spinning and tension. Does that mean a wagon load of Europeans rolled straight into the Terim one day and set up a loom? Probably not. It more likely means that knowledge about how to twist fiber, how to set up warp and weft, and how to produce durable patterned cloth diffuse slowly along those pural routes. A shepherd in the Altai picks up a clever weaving trick from someone in the Minosk Basin, who got it from someone on the western steppe, who adapted something they saw even further west. A generation or three later, a traveler from the northern foothills stops at a tar mower's for a season, marries in, and his or her weaving habits come along for the ride. Metal tells a similar story. Bronze doesn't occur naturally. You have to know where to find copper ores and tin, how to smelt them, how to mix them in the right proportions, and how to cast or hammer the result. That knowledge developed in multiple places across Eurasia. But by the early 2nd millennium BCE, metallurgical traditions are already stretching across the steppe from the Urals to western China. In and around the term we start finding metal objects, knives, awls, ornaments, whose composition and manufacture link them to these wider technological currents. The exact styles and alloy recipes vary, and debates rage about who borrowed from whom, but the overall pattern is clear. People in this remote desert were not inventing metallurgy in isolation, yet when you look closely, you don't see a sudden overwhelming flood of foreign metal goods swamping a passive local culture. You see punctuated trickles, a few imported objects here, locally made items there, hybrid styles blending outside influences with local tastes. Same story with domesticated animals. Sheep and goats first show up in the Near East. Cattle and wheat have their own centers of origin further west. Millet starts out in China. Horses, in terms of riding and chariotry, seem to have been first mastered on the western steppe. By the time the earliest harem mummies were being buried, this package of domesticates and associated practices had spread thousands of kilometers in multiple directions. But it didn't spread as a single wave of Indo-Europeans, or proto-this, or proto-that steamrolling across the map, no matter what nationalist stories like to imagine. Instead, it seems to have traveled in modules. Millet moves west from North China into the Hexi Corridor, then further into Central Asia and beyond. Wheat and barley move east from Southwest Asia along highland and steppe routes, eventually reaching northern China. Sheep and goats fan out, with mobile herders in almost every direction. Horses, once harnessed to chariots or ridden, create new possibilities for long-distance travel and prestige warfare. The Tarim is one of the places where those eastward and westward flows meet and mix. Early on, you get wheat and sheep and steppe-style elements blended with millet and other East Asian influences. Later, you see horses and chariot gear echoing developments on the steppe to the west and north. So, what does that tell us about contact versus population replacement? This is where the DNA results, which we'll get into more deeply in the next sections, matter. When researchers first sequenced ancient genomes from the tar mummies, one surprise was how little direct genetic input they seemed to have from those steppe populations you might expect, given all the cultural similarities. Textiles that look steppe-style, certain burial features that rhyme with Western traditions, animals and crops that clearly traveled. But the core ancestry of some of these early tar communities doesn't match cleanly with the steppe newcomers who are moving into parts of Xinjiang and Central Asia around the same time. If entire steppe clans had simply migrated en masse into the time and replaced whoever was there before, you'd expect their genetic signature to dominate. Instead, what you see, at least in the early periods, is more consistent with strong local continuity mixed with limited gene flow. In plain language, the people living there weren't being wiped out and swapped wholesale for foreigners. They were absorbing ideas, goods, and a smaller number of outsiders into an existing population. That distinction matters. Finding a Western-style wagon burial or a certain type of wool twill doesn't automatically mean the buried person was themselves a migrant from the far west. It could mean they or their parents traded with such people, copied their gear, learned their weaving, adopted their prestige symbols, or intermarried with a few individuals. Archaeology is full of these pots versus people debates. When you see a new kind of object or practice, are you looking at new people or just new styles moving through old communities? In the Tarim, the balance of evidence right now leans toward networks over invasions, especially in the earliest phases. You can literally track some of these networks in the dirt. Certain stones used for tools or ornaments have geological fingerprints. The same type of jade, for instance, shows up both near its mountain sources and far away in burial goods. Later on, jade from the Clan Mountains will become a prized commodity in early Chinese courts, flowing east through what will become major Silk Road corridors. The germs of that pattern, valuable stones moving out of Tarim-adjacent mountains into distant societies, likely predate written records. Plant remains tell their own version. Millet here, wheat there, each arriving from opposite directions. Spores, pollen, and carbonized seeds along steppe and valley routes show that by the time the term mummies were being buried, farmers and herders across a vast stretch of Eurasia were already experimenting with mixed crop packages. Local staples plus exotic newcomers that perform differently in their specific climates. Viewed from above, the term looks less like an isolated island and more like a crossroads where multiple small roads meet, overlap, and continue on. That doesn't mean it was cosmopolitan in the way later Silk Road cities would be. You're not walking through an 1800 BCE version of Kashgar, packed with foreign merchants and translators from 10-language families. Most people in a community probably spent their entire lives within a few hundred kilometers of their home oasis. But some individuals didn't. The isotopic hints of non-local childhoods, the occasional foreign-style object made from non-local material, the gradual appearance of far-traveled crops and technologies, all imply that a subset of people were doing longer-distance circuits. Maybe they were specialists, traders, metal workers, caravan leaders, avant. Maybe they were just families pushed further in a bad year who then stayed. Whatever you call them, their movement stitched the term into something bigger. By the time formal Silk Road routes emerge in the historical record, Hananoi's writing reports, Central Asian kingdoms jockeying for control of passes, Buddhist pilgrims leaving travelogues, they're grafting onto this much older skeleton set. They're intensifying paths that already existed, scaling up exchange, bureaucratizing what used to be personal arrangements and kin-based deals. The temptation is to ask, so, who were the original term people? Were they Western, Eastern, something else? But that framing misses the point. A place like the term doesn't have a single origin story. It has layers. Genetically, some of those early mummies look like the descendants of very ancient local lineages, people whose roots in Inner Asia may go back far beyond the Bronze Age. Culturally, they're plugged into multiple spheres at once. Steppe herders to the north and west, early Chinese farmers to the east, highland and oasis societies to the south and southwest. Economically, they're running a hybrid system that borrows from all of the above. Crossroads isn't just a poetic label here. It's a literal description of how their world worked. Ideas and genes and goods weren't flowing in just one direction. They were bouncing, looping, getting reworked in each local context, and sometimes sent back out transformed. A weaving pattern that came in from the west might generations later travel back westward in slightly altered form. A crop that arrived from the east might be selectively bred in Tarim conditions, then carried onward by herders heading into new valleys. When you stand in one of those cemeteries now and look out across the dead flat desert, it's hard to imagine it as a node in a continent-spanning network. But when those poles and boat-shaped coffins were rising fresh from the sand, the people who built them were already part of multiple overlapping maps: grazing maps, marriage maps, trade maps, pilgrimage maps. The formal Silk Road with its caravans and imperial politics is just the visible tip of that iceberg. Beneath it lies this older, slower, but no less important world of exchange, one in which the Tarim mummies were active participants. Understanding that the world is key to decoding what their DNA and their supposed mystery actually mean. Because once you see the Tarim as a crossroads, not a closed box, genetic outliers in the middle of nowhere stops being a satisfying story. And the real puzzle becomes even more interesting. So, let's turn to that puzzle and to what those much publicized DNA studies really show and don't show about who these people were. When those first genome papers on the Terran mummies dropped, you could almost hear the keyboards warming up. Mystery race found in China. DNA matches no known people. Lost civilization. It's tailor-made for clicks. Desert mummies, strange faces, genetic enigma, set. But the way ancient DNA actually works, and what it can and can't tell you, is a lot less like a movie twist, and a lot more like slow, careful detective work. Start with the basics. DNA is not a name tag. It doesn't come with a label that says, "Hi, my name is Protoltic Horse Lord," or "Hi, I'm an Indo-Aryan trader." What ancient DNA gives you is patterns. How similar or different one individual's genome is compared to others, living or dead, that we've sampled and sequenced from those patterns, geneticists and fur relationships, shared ancestry, degrees of isolation, episodes of mixing. That means all of the fancy conclusions, no known population, unique lineage, step ancestry, East Asian component are really just shorthand. They're ways of summarizing what happens when you compare one set of genomes to all the others sitting in our databases. If you don't know that, headlines sound like proclamations from on high. Once you do, you realize they're more like, with the pieces we currently have on the table, this is the best fit we can see right now. And those pieces, they're incomplete, very incomplete. Picture a giant reference map of human genetic variation. Every dot on the map is a population we've sequenced. Some regions, modern Europeans, Han Chinese, certain big urban centers are covered in dots. Other huge areas, Inner Asia, small mountain communities, groups that no longer exist, have only a handful of dots, or none at all. When scientists say a mummy's genome doesn't match any known population, what they literally mean is among the dots we currently have, there isn't one that lines up neatly. That doesn't mean the person was an alien. It doesn't mean they popped into existence in a single oasis, out of nowhere. It means the closest matching populations either haven't been sampled, no longer survive as distinct groups, or are buried in places we haven't yet excavated. No known population is as much about our sampling gaps as it is about the people we're studying. And before you can even get to that comparison stage, you have to win a very different kind of battle, the fight against contamination. Ancient DNA is fragile. In a place like the Tarium, the dryness and salt help preserve tissues beautifully, which is why the faces and hair of the mummies can look eerily fresh. But at the molecular level, their DNA is still broken, fragmented, and chemically damaged by time. That damage is actually useful because it carries a signature that lets scientists distinguish ancient molecules from modern ones. But it also means you're working with tiny scraps of information, often outnumbered by contaminants. Contaminants are everywhere. In the soil that seeped into the coffin, in the bacteria that colonized the body over millennia, in the breath, sweat, and skin cells of every person who ever dug up, handled, or displayed those remains. Many of the tin mummies were excavated decades ago, long before anyone dreamed of genomic sequencing, sometimes with bare hands and no masks. From a geneticist perspective, that's like leaving a crime scene open to the public for years and then trying to recover the original fingerprints. So labs get paranoid, extremely paranoid. When they work on these remains, they do it in clean rooms that look like something out of a high-end semiconductor facility. Overpressure systems, filtered air, full body suits, UV lights to zap stray DNA. Tools and surfaces get bleached, baked, and irradiated. Only specific parts of the body, inner portions of teeth, dense parts of the petrous bone near the ear, are sampled because those are better at shielding surviving ancient DNA from the outside world. Even then, nobody trusts a single result. Key findings get replicated in independent labs using independently extracted samples. Scientists check for telltale damage patterns that prove the DNA really is ancient. They estimate contamination levels by looking at differences between mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from your mother, and the nuclear genome, or by checking whether sequences that are supposed to all be the same in a person actually show a mishmash of variants. If contamination is high, those samples get sidelined or discarded. Why all this trouble? Because one stray grad student's skin cell can masquerade as mysterious new ancestry if you're not ruthless about controls. And because when you're telling stories about real ancient people, stories that modern communities might tie to their own identities, you can't afford to build those stories on sloppy lab work. Once you've done all that, and you're reasonably confident you're looking at the actual genome of someone who lived and died in the term thousands of years ago, the next step is to place that genome in context. That's where those components drift and admixture words start popping up in papers and then turn into misquoted headlines. Think of ancestry components like ingredients in a long simmering stew. If you take a big sample of modern and ancient genomes from across Eurasia and ask a computer program to break down their variation into clusters, you might get, say, one cluster that's common in Western steppe herders, another that's common in early East Asian farmers, another in ancient Siberian foragers, and so on. None of these clusters is a people in the everyday sense. They're statistical patterns, recurring combinations of genetic variants. When geneticists say an individual is, for example, 60% this component, 40% that component, they're saying, based on the variation we see, chunks of their genome look most similar to chunks found in these reference groups. That's the admixture part. Evidence that their ancestors weren't one isolated lineage, but a mix of groups that had previously diverged. Drift is what happens in between those mixing events. When populations stay relatively small or isolated for a long time, they tend to stay relatively stable. Random chance causes certain genetic variants to become more common, others to vanish without any particular selective reason. Over thousands of years, drift can make two groups that started out similar look quite different genetically, even if neither of them was ever very large or dramatic in cultural terms. On a PCA plot or a genetic tree, drifted populations can sit way off to the side as if they were outliers simply because they've been doing their own quiet thing for a very long time. Now fold these ideas back into the tar story. When the early genome studies came out, one of the striking findings was that some of these mummies' core ancestry didn't line up neatly with the big well-known Bronze Age groups around them. They didn't look like a straightforward mix of steppe herders plus adjacent East Asian farmers, even though their material culture clearly echoed both spheres. Instead, they carried a heavy dose of ancestry that seemed to trace back to much older inner Asian hunter-gatherer lineages, deep-drifted components that modern populations only retain in diluted form, if at all. In technical language, that got summarized as they don't derive directly from any of the major contemporaneous populations in our reference panel. In headline language, it became, they match no known population on Earth. You can see the leap. The sober version is, given the ancient and modern genomes we've sampled so far, their primary ancestry doesn't map cleanly onto any one existing reference group. It instead looks like a deeply diverged lineage with limited later admixture. The clickbait version is they came from nowhere, and this is where expectations have to be reset. Ancient DNA is powerful. It can rule out some stories. If, for instance, the Taran mummies had turned out to be genetically indistinguishable from known Bronze Age steppe groups, that would support a straightforward migration and replacement scenario. If they had looked basically like early Chinese farmers moved west, that would push interpretations in a different direction. Instead, the results so far have complicated those simple narratives, strong local continuity in some lineages, surprisingly little early steppe input, and later on more mixing as new populations arrive. But what genetics can't do on its own is tell you what language these people spoke, what myths they told, how they understood themselves, or what names they used for neighbors and enemies. A unique ancestry component is not the same thing as a lost civilization. An ancient North Eurasian-related lineage is not automatically protox or protoi, no matter how tempting it is to connect those dots to modern ethnic labels. DNA doesn't record cultural boundaries. It doesn't know about trade routes, marriage alliances, shifting clan identities, or the way a weaving technique can slide from one group to another without large-scale migrations. A single genetic population can splinter linguistically and culturally. Conversely, multiple genetic lineages can converge on a shared identity and language through alliance and assimilation. So, when you see a headline claiming that the Tar mummies weren't related to any known people, it's worth translating that back into what scientists are actually saying. They're not declaring that these folks were outside the human family tree. They're pointing out that within our current sampling, their genomes anchor a branch that doesn't correspond neatly to any single modern group. And that seems to preserve traces of very ancient inner Asian ancestry that later got swamped or diluted elsewhere. And that, if anything, fits the picture we've been building. The Tarim is a crossroads, not an island. Locally rooted lineages shaped by deep time and drift plugged into long-distance networks that carried in new crops, animals, technologies, and eventually people. Their genes tell one part of that story. Their clothes, tools, burial rites, and trade connections tell another. The real trick and the real challenge is to line those stories up without letting any single line of evidence, especially the sexier one with the double helix, drown out the rest. Because when you put the genetics back into that wider web of archaeology, linguistics, and history, the term mummies stop being a clickbait people from nowhere and start looking like something much more interesting. The descendants of a very old inner Asian lineage living at a node where ancient threads of genes and culture kept knotting and reknotting over thousands of years. To see how that plays out in detail, we have to zoom in on what the DNA studies actually say on the specific components, the timing of admixture, and how different cemeteries in and around the Terim compare to each other. That's where the patterns really start to emerge, and where some of the more dramatic claims about European mummies in China begin to fall apart. So, let's strip away the headlines and walk through what the actual genetic studies so far are really telling us about these people. The first big thing you notice when you look at the early Tarim genomes, the ones from sites like Si and Gomugu, roughly 2000 BCE to maybe 1500 BCE, is how weirdly simple they are in genetic terms. Not simple as in primitive, simple as in unmixed. Instead of being a neat cocktail of steppe herder ancestry plus nearby East Asian farmer ancestry, what many archaeologists expected in a Bronze Age frontier zone, you get individuals whose genomes are dominated by one very old, very drifted inner Asian hunter-gatherer lineage. In the papers, you'll see this described as ancient North Eurasian related or related ancestry. That label comes from even older genomes found thousands of kilometers away in Siberia and Central Asia. People who lived during and after the Ice Age. The Tarim individuals don't look exactly like those Ice Age Siberians. Too much time has passed. Too much drift has piled up. But when you ask the computer, which known ancient genomes do these mummies most resemble, those ancient northern foragers are the ones that keep popping up as their closest deep relatives. And here's the kicker. For those early tar mummies, there's little to no obvious sign of mixing with the big Bronze Age players who were swirling around them. The Western steppe herders who were pushing across Central Asia, the early East Asian farmers who were expanding westward. Genetically, traces of those groups in the earliest tar samples are minimal to non-existent. A few individuals might show a faint whisper of steppe or East Asian-related ancestry, but the core signal is stubbornly local, stubbornly old. That's where the genetically distinct language comes from. On plots that visualize genetic similarity, those early Tarim individuals don't sit in the middle of a bunch of Bronze Age groups. They occupy their own little island offset from everyone else. They're not aliens. They're a lineage that has been bottled up and stewing in genetic isolation long enough to drift away from its cousins. This is what long-term isolation does. Imagine a small population tucked into a series of oases, getting most of its marriage partners from the same limited pool of neighboring families for centuries, maybe millennia. No big waves of newcomers, just the occasional trickle. Random gene variants rise and fall by chance. Over time, the group's genetic profile becomes more and more distinctive. Not because anything dramatic is happening, but because nothing dramatic is happening. No large influxes, no big mixture events to reset the deck. From a distance in time, that quiet isolation looks spectacular. On a genetic tree, you suddenly see this branch that left the main trunk early and then kept growing off to the side by itself. That's the no-known population angle. Not that these people don't belong on the tree, but that their branch doesn't merge directly with any modern group we've sampled. If any living communities are descended from that lineage, they've either mixed so much that the original signal is faint, or we simply haven't sequenced them yet. But that's only the opening act, because the Tarim Basin isn't just one cemetery, one moment frozen in amber. When you widen the lens to look at nearby regions and later time periods, you start to see different patterns. In places like the Zungarian Basin to the north, and in some later Tarim sites, you do get individuals who carry substantial Western steer herder ancestry, people whose genetic profiles align closely with those mobile pastoralists from the West. Others show more East Asian-related ancestry. Some look like complex mixes. Old inner Asian hunter-gatherer components, plus steppe input, plus East Asian farmer-related genes. In other words, You have to be very careful about which tar mummies you're talking about. Early cemeteries in the heart of the basin can tell a different genetic story from later cemeteries on the rims. A site dated to 2000 BCE might show almost pure local ancestry. A site from 1000 BCE or 500 BCEC might sit on top of centuries of incoming migrants and intermarriage. Group all of them together under one mysterious label and you flatten a lot of history. This is why geneticists slice their analyses so finely. They don't just say Tarbasan people. They talk about specific individuals from specific graves with specific radiocarbon dates. They run models that test, for example, can this person's genome be explained as a mixture of X% ancient North Eurasian L-like ancestry plus Y% Western steppe herder ancestry. Then they tweak the inputs. What if you use a different ancient Siberian as a proxy? What if you add an early Yellow River farmer population to the model? Does the fit improve or get worse? From that kind of iterative testing, some tentative patterns emerge. Early Tarim dominated by a relict Inner Asian lineage, almost no major outside input detectable. Contemporary Zungaria and other nearby regions set. More obvious mixing between local foragers, incoming steppe herders, and East Asian farmer-related groups. Later periods, in and around the Tajam, increasingly complex mosaics with clear evidence that the once isolated lineages are being folded into a much broader genetic network. Now contrast that with the material culture. Even those earliest genetically simple tiers in people are buried with things that scream connectivity. They're herring animals that originated outside the basin. They're using crops that were domesticated far away. Their clothing techniques, their burial structures, even some of their symbolic motifs have clear parallels in cultures beyond the desert. This is the critical distinction. Genetic ancestry versus cultural influence. Genes mostly move with people. Artifacts and ideas can move without large-scale migration. A local population can adopt the wool of an animal first domesticated elsewhere, the style of a garment invented hundreds of kilometers away. Or the burial rite of a neighboring group without the underlying population being massively replaced. A handful of foreign traders, artisans or marriage partners might be enough to carry in those innovations, especially if local communities are curious, flexible, and plugged into exchange networks. So when you see an early Tarim individual who is, say, 90+% derived from that old Inner Asian hunter-gatherer lineage, but who is wrapped in a felt hat that looks steppish and buried with wheat that traces back to the Near East, the genetic result and the archaeological result are not in conflict. They're showing you different layers of the same story. Culturally, these people are in conversation with the outside world. Genetically, at that early stage, they still look like the descendants of a long, isolated local lineage. Flip it around for some later individuals who do carry significant steppe or East Asian-related ancestry. Those people may be the descendants of actual migrants or of generations of intermarriage between locals and newcomers. Their bodies record those movements. But even then, their artifacts don't just turn into the toolkit of their ancestors' homeland. They're hybrid local adapted to Tarim life. Cultural change does not track genetic change one tune. This is why equating steppe ancestry with steppe culture or East Asian ancestry with Chinese culture leads you into all kinds of traps. You're trying to make a messy many-to-many relationship into a clean one-tune mapping that simply doesn't exist. There's another wrinkle time. The first major genome study of the Mummies was based on a limited number of individuals from a handful of sites. That was a huge leap forward, but it's still a tiny snapshot of thousands of years of occupation. As more burials get sampled, especially from underrepresented regions or time periods, those neat early conclusions are almost guaranteed to get fuzzier. This is already a pattern in ancient DNA studies elsewhere. The first genomes from Europe suggested one story about farmer migrations and hunter-gatherer survival. Then more samples showed up from different valleys, different centuries. And suddenly, the picture got more complicated. Pockets of continuity here, abrupt replacements there, unexpected back migrations in between. Africa, the Americas, South Asia, every region that gets denser sampling ends up with a more tangled, more interesting history than the first wave of papers suggested. There's no reason to think the tar will be different. Right now, the narrative goes something like early, highly isolated Inner Asian lineage at the core of the basin. Later, a mixture with steppe and East Asian populations as the Bronze and Iron Age world plugs the region into bigger networks. That's a reasonable outline given the current data. But move 10 years into the future after dozens more cemeteries have been sequenced, and the lines between early and late may blur. We may find yet older ancestors of the Tarim lineages in places we haven't even looked at. We may discover unsampled populations that act as missing intermediates, suddenly making those no-known population statements feel overly dramatic. Even the labels we're using, ancient North Eurasian, Western steppe herder, East Asian farmers, are proxies, shortcuts based on a still incomplete cast of characters. Add a few new ancient genomes from, say, previously unsampled parts of the Tianan or Kungun foothills, and our statistical clusters could reconfigure. What we now see as a single A and E related component might split into multiple branches, one of which ends up mapping much more closely onto the Tarim group. That's not a failure of the science. That's exactly how the science is supposed to work. Each new sample isn't just another data point, it's a potential reshaping of the whole reference map. So, when you hear that the Tar mummies' DNA matched no known population, you can translate it like this. Based on a limited but growing set of ancient and modern genomes, the earliest individuals we've tested from the basin seem to carry a large proportion of ancestry from a long, isolated inner Asian lineage that is represented in modern populations. Later on, as more people move through the region, the genetic picture gets more mixed. That's it. No vanished super race, no humans from off-planet, just the messy, fascinating reality of an old desert crossroads, where a deeply rooted local population met an incoming tide of people, goods, and ideas, and where different lines of evidence, genetic and cultural, intersect without ever lining up perfectly. Once you see the DNA that way, as one thread in a larger weave, the really interesting questions become less about what box do these people fit into, and more about who were they in their own time. How did they see themselves? How did they navigate being both deeply local and deeply connected? To even begin to answer that, we have to leave the double helix and go back to the things they held, wore, and built. And that's where the theories about who they were start to get really contentious. So let's walk through the main contenders, because underneath all the noise, most serious theories about the early Terran people fall into three broad camps: deep-rooted locals, steppe-linked newcomers, and something in between. A web of small mixed communities that don't map neatly onto any single label. Start with the locals model, because right now, that's the one best supported by the early DNA. In this view, the people buried in those earliest desert cemeteries weren't Martians from the steppe or the east. They were the descendants of hunter-gatherer and early pastoral groups who had already been moving around the broader inner Asian mountain corridor for a very long time. As climate shifted and neighboring regions filled up, some of these groups drifted into the Tar Basin and found something that against all odds worked: narrow green belts around springs and rivers where you could graze animals, grow hardy crops, and outlast the dunes. In other words, you don't need a dramatic migration event to explain them. You just need continuity, a lineage that rooted itself early in or near the basin, and then mostly stayed put. Over centuries, maybe millennia, those people adjusted their toolkit, picked up animals and crops from whoever passed by, and slowly turned themselves into specialists of desert oasis life. The genetics fit this reasonably well. A long, isolated inner Asian hunter-gatherer ancestry, heavily drifted with only faint hints of larger mixing events early on. The pottery, the textiles, the burial architecture, all of that can be explained as cultural borrowing layered on top of a stable local population. But there's a twist. Local here does not mean unchanging or pure. Even in the most isolation-heavy scenarios, you still have some level of contact. Traders show up, herders push through, marriages happen across group boundaries. The trick is that the numbers stay small. Maybe one outsider joins a community of 50 people every few generations. Over the long run, those drips of foreign ancestry get diluted into the local gene pool. They leave signatures if you look closely enough, but they don't overturn the basic pattern of continuity. Then there's the second camp, the steppe-linked model. This one starts from the very real fact that all around the Tarim Basin during the Bronze Age, you do have steppe-ribbed pastoralists on the move. To the north and west, archaeologists find cultures that look and test genetically like Western steppe herders or their descendants, mobile groups with wagons, horses, cattle, sheep, and a package of burial customs and artifacts that tend to travel together. From this angle, it's tempting to see the Tar mummies as an offshoot of that expansion. Maybe a clan of steppe herders pushed south through the mountain passes, stumbled into the basin, and decided to settle. Over time, their distinctive clothing styles, their felt hats, their wheel technology get baked into everyday life. Their genomes should show a hefty dose of steppe ancestry, and in some later burials, they do. So, proponents of this view tend to emphasize those later, more mixed individuals and the clear steppe-style elements in material culture. The woolen textiles that look familiar from northern sites, the wagon remains, the burial posts that echo motifs found in steppe cemeteries. The argument goes something like this. Even if the very first settlers in the basin had older roots, it was the steppe-linked groups who really defined the term culture we recognize in the archaeological record. The problem is that when you zoom in on the earliest term genomes we have, they don't look like simple steppe outposts genetically. The steppe signature is weak to absent in many of them, so if there was a big clean wave of steppe migrants founding those first cemeteries, we're not seeing it in the DNA yet. Any steppe-related input at that stage has to have been minor or heavily diluted by locals or focused in parts of the basin that we haven't sampled. That's where the third model comes in the mixed networks view. Instead of choosing between locals and migrants, this approach treats the Taran Basin as one node in a much larger web that ran from the far Kazakh steppe down through the Tian, across the Gansu corridor and into northern China and beyond. In this picture, you have multiple small groups, some with more ancient Inner Asian ancestry, some with more steppe ancestry, some with more East Asian farmer ancestry, circulating around the edges of the desert for centuries. Every so often, one of these groups plants itself at an oasis and stays long enough to leave a cemetery, a set of houses, a recognizable material culture layer. Then conditions shift. Water sources move. Trade routes route. Political pressures elsewhere send new people into the region. Some of the old families hang on. Others move, merge, or vanish. The result over 1,000 years is a mosaic. Patches of deep local continuity side by side, with patches that are much more obviously shaped by newcomers. In that kind of system, you should expect exactly what we're seeing. Some cemeteries where people look genetically like long, isolated Inner Asian lineages, and other sites sometimes not that far away, and only a few centuries later, where you can clearly pick up steppe or East Asian ancestry mixing in. You should also expect cultural elements to hop around more freely than genes, ping-ponging through trade and imitation, showing up in places where the underlying DNA hasn't changed much at all. That last part is key because it brings us to the second big idea. Language, culture, and genes do not move in lockstep. A population can switch languages without a major genetic turnover. A small elite group can impose its speech, its writing system, even its gods onto a much larger local population, leaving only a thin genetic trace, but a massive cultural one. Think about how many people today speak English, Spanish, or Arabic, whose ancestry is mostly local to places those languages didn't originate. The reverse can happen too. Large-scale migration can bring in new genetic ancestry without completely overwriting local customs. Newcomers adopt local pottery styles, local building techniques, local recipes because they're practical. The result is bodies that say mixed origins and artifacts that say business as usual. So when people argue about what language the early Terran people might have spoken, were they some lost branch of Indo-European, maybe linked to Terrarian, or speakers of an entirely different now extinct family? They're often tempted to lean on genetics for answers it can't really give. If you find steppe ancestry, that does not automatically mean Indo-European language. Here, if you find East Asian ancestry, that does not automatically mean Proto-Chinese speakers. The correlations between genes and languages are at best loose and pattern-based. At worst, they're misleading. The same goes for culture. Steppe-style hats do not require steppe genomes. Wheat and sheep do not require nearest Eastern ancestry. A local Tarim group could have adopted all of those things through trade, alliance, or sheer curiosity. Conversely, steppe-drived migrants could have ended up wearing desert-style gear and building trim-style graves within a couple of generations. Now, layer in the demographic reality of oasis life. We're not talking about giant, constantly replenished populations here. We're talking about small founding groups, maybe a handful of extended families, establishing themselves around a specific water source. For the next few generations, marriage partners are mostly drawn from within that limited circle or from a couple of nearby oases with similar histories. If a few dozen people carry some rare gene variant, random chance alone can push that variant to be very common or very rare in their descendants. Geneticists call this founder effect and genetic drift. In a big, well-connected population, drift is slow. The signal of any one small group gets diluted. In tiny, semi-isolated oasis communities, drift is fast and brutal. Within a few hundred years, you can have populations whose genetic profiles look surprisingly odd compared to their neighbors. Not because they came from aliens, but because they descended from a narrow slice of human diversity that got walled off for a while. The early Tarim group fits this pattern nicely. Take a small subset of the broader, inner Asian hunter-gatherer variation, drop them into a marginal but stable niche, limit their contact with outsiders, and wait 1,000 years. By the time we dig up their graves, their genomes occupy their own little island on our plots. That doesn't mean they lack relatives. It means their closest relatives either haven't been sampled or have been so churned up by later mixing that the old signal is hard to see. That's the sober population genetic explanation, but it's competing in the public imagination with much flashier claims. You'll see books and videos insisting that the tar mummies were Europeans deep in ancient China, as if that label actually maps onto Bronze Age realities. You'll see people leap from light hair or tall stature to sweeping statements about Caucasian races colonizing Asia. You'll see others spin the no-known population line into talk of lost civilizations, Atlantean refugees, or visitors from somewhere beyond the human family tree entirely. All of that goes wildly beyond the evidence. Light hair can be caused by multiple gene variants, some of which arose long before any modern race categories. Skin, hair, and eye color can shift surprisingly fast in small, isolated populations. Cranial shapes and body builds can converge under similar environmental pressures. None of these traits by themselves tell you who a group really was in the deep genetic or cultural sense. Calling the Tarim mummies European is especially misleading. The genetic components in early Europeans and early Inner Asian groups partly overlap because they share deep Ice Age ancestors, not because one group is a simple offshoot of the other. Drawing a straight modern political border across that ancient continuum and then assigning people to sides is a 21st century move, not a Bronze Age reality. Even the more respectable popular claims that the term mummies must be ancestors of a particular historical group mentioned in Chinese texts, or that they must have spoken a specific language, are often built on more confidence than data. They take a few intriguing correspondences and stretch them into full identities. Sometimes those hypotheses will turn out to be partly right. Often they'll need major revision as more evidence comes in. And that's the last crucial point. This mystery is not a static puzzle with one correct answer. It's an evolving story. Every new cemetery that's excavated, every set of bones that gets sequenced, every reanalysis of old textiles or plant remains can shift the balance between our three main models. A site that looks local today might, after better sampling, reveal layers of steppe-linked newcomers. A community we assume is made of migrants might turn out to be mostly local people with a thin sprinkling of foreign ancestry. A rare genetic component we think is unique to the tar might show up in some forgotten valley, hundreds of kilometers away, suddenly tying these mysterious mummies into a larger, more familiar network. So for now, the most honest answer to who were they is a layered one. They were in part the descendants of very old Inner Asian lineages that found refuge in and around the Tarim oases, drifted in relative isolation, and developed their own ways of living in the desert. They were over time increasingly entangled with steppe herders, East Asian farmers, and other groups who passed through or settled nearby, creating communities whose genes, languages, and cultures did not all follow the same paths. They were neither completely cut off nor simply transplanted from somewhere else. They were in short people negotiating a harsh landscape in a changing world, using whatever tools, ideas, and alliances they could muster, just like everyone else. And if that sounds abstract, it won't for long. Because the moment you start asking who were they, you bump up against another question, one that makes this whole debate much more immediate. Who gets to decide? Who has the right to dig them up, sample their bones, tell their story, and claim them as ancestors? That's where science meets politics. And with the tar mummies, that collision has been especially intense. When you're dealing with people who died 4,000 years ago, it's easy to treat them like data. Bones become specimens. Hair becomes samples. A woman buried with a baby becomes individual M45 with subad adult. The language strips away the personhood. And for scientists, that can be a psychological shield. It makes it easier to drill into a femur or grind up a tooth for DNA. But not everyone sees it that way. And they're not wrong. For many communities, indigenous groups in the Americas, First Nations in Australia, local peoples across Asia and Europe, human remains, no matter how old, are still ancestors. They have spiritual significance. They have stories attached to them. Even if those stories are fragmented or contested, digging them up, cutting into them, shipping bits of them to distant labs, that isn't just research, it's an intrusion. So before we even get to the politics of the Taram mummies specifically, there's a bigger, uncomfortable truth. Human remains research always sits on an ethical fault line. There is no neutral ground. Every decision, excavate or leave in place, sample or not, publish or hold back, is a decision about how much weight to give the living versus the dead, the local versus the global, the pursuit of knowledge versus the duty of care. With the tar mummies, that tension gets amplified because these bodies are spectacularly well preserved. You're not just dealing with anonymous skeletons, you're looking at faces, expressions, hair that could almost be touched and combed. People recognize something human and immediate in those remains. They project themselves onto them. They feel connection and sometimes ownership. Who does get to claim them? In modern political terms, the Tar Basin lies within the borders of the People's Republic of China in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. That word autonomous hides a lot of complexity. Multiple ethnic groups live there today. Uyghurs, Han Chinese, Kazakhs, Tajik and others. Each has its own history, its own narratives about who came first, who belongs, who has deep roots in the land. Drop 4,000-year-old mummies into that landscape, and they don't stay neutral. They become symbols. Local Uyghur activists and some scholars have at times pointed to the mummies as evidence of an ancient, distinct population in the region. People with their own culture separate from early dynastic China. Some steppe-oriented nationalisms look at the clothing, the textiles, the apparent pastoral lifestyle, and say these were our nomadic ancestors. On the other side, Chinese state narratives have tended to emphasize the idea that Xinjiang has been part of a broader Chinese cultural sphere for a very long time, and that ancient diversity there ultimately feeds into a single, unified national story. You can see the problem. The same set of graves can be mobilized to tell completely different political tales. The science doesn't change. The interpretive frame does. Now add in an international audience primed by decades of sensational headlines. European mummies in China, blonde Terran princess, lost white tribe of the Silk Road. Those phrases may have been good for clicks, but they also imported a whole extra layer of racial and civilizational baggage into the discussion. Some Western commentators seized on the tar mummies as supposed proof that Europeans were in Xinjiang first, as if modern racial categories could be pasted onto Bronze Age Inner Asia. That narrative in turn fed into geopolitical debates about whose history counts and whose presence is legitimate. None of this helps the science. It muddies it. When archaeologists and geneticists step into a field like that, they're not just wearing lab coats. Whether they like it or not, they're perceived as potential allies or threats in very modern conflicts. Their words get mined for sound bites. A cautious statement like no close match to sampled populations mutates into no known relatives on Earth in the media pipeline. A subtle interpretation of ancestry proves these people weren't Chinese or shows Xinjiang has always been multicultural, depending on who's quoting it. That's where ethics stops being a separate, after-the-fact conversation and becomes part of the research design itself. Take repatriation. In some parts of the world, there are clear legal frameworks that say if ancient remains are culturally affiliated with a living group, then they are protected by law. Those remains need to be returned for burial or curation under that community's control. Famous cases like the Kennewick Man in the United States forced archaeologists to confront the fact that you can't just treat old bones as a free resource forever. The wishes of descendant communities matter even when they conflict with scientific curiosity. In Xinjiang, the picture is more complicated. Who counts as a descendant community of a 4,000-year-old oasis group whose language is unknown and whose genetic profile doesn't map cleanly onto any single living population? Modern weavers, broader, inner Asian groups, the Chinese nation as a whole. There isn't a simple, universally agreed answer. and the politics of the region make that conversation even harder to have in the open. What we do know is that local voices and local authorities have a major say in what happens. Excavations are licensed by regional institutes and overseen by Chinese archaeologists. Decisions about whether remains can leave the region or the country are not made in Western universities. Sometimes that means foreign labs get access to tiny amounts of bone powder and hair with strict conditions. Sometimes it means no access at all. To scientists outside China, that can feel restrictive. To communities inside the region, it can feel like the bare minimum of control over their own heritage. This is where best practices start to matter. At their most responsible, projects involving ancient human remains, especially in politically sensitive places, try to follow a few core principles. First, transparency. That means being clear from the outset about what's being excavated, what's being sampled, and why. It means explaining to local partners in plain language what destructive analyses will do and what they might reveal. It also means being honest in publications and public outreach about the limitations of the data, not overselling results to get headlines. Second, collaboration. Not the token kind where a local co-author gets added at the last minute, but genuine long-term partnerships. Local archaeologists, museum staff, and community representatives should be involved in setting research questions, interpreting findings, and deciding how, when, and where the material is displayed. Ideally, samples and data are co-owned, and capacity is built so that more of the cutting-edge work can be done locally over time. Third, careful public communication. Researchers can't control every article that gets written about their work, but they can choose their words wisely. Avoiding simplistic ethnic labels, emphasizing uncertainty, and explicitly warning against racist or nationalist misuses of the data won't stop bad faith actors entirely, but it does set a baseline. It gives journalists and educators better quotes to work with than no known population and European face in China. In the case of the Tarim mummies, you can see some of this playing out in real time. Recent genetics papers have been careful to stress that the early Tarim individuals are not Europeans, not alien, but a deeply drifted inner Asian lineage with complex ties to wider population groups. Archaeologists working in Xinjiang have increasingly highlighted the diversity of cultures in the region, rather than trying to shoehorn them into modern boxes. Some museums have toned down the more sensational racial framing of their mummy exhibits. At the same time, access remains uneven. Not all cemeteries are open to study. Not all remains can be sampled. Some material is politically sensitive and therefore off limits to foreign teams. From a purely scientific point of view, that's frustrating. Those missing pieces could answer real questions about how isolated or how connected different oases were over time. But from an ethical angle, those gaps are partly the point. Ethics is not just about saying, here's how to squeeze maximum information from these bodies while being polite. Sometimes it's about accepting that certain questions will stay unanswered or only partly answerable, because the cost of pushing further would be too high for the people who actually live with the consequences. Think about what you'd want centuries from now if someone dug up your grave. Would you be okay with your bones being drilled and your face being reconstructed and displayed to millions of strangers? Maybe you would, in the name of science. Maybe you wouldn't. Now imagine that thousands of years have passed and no one knows exactly which of today's communities you're related to. Who gets to decide on your behalf? With the term mummies, that decision currently rests with a mixture of state institutions, regional authorities, and academic bodies. Local communities, Viga, Kazakh, Han, and others have varying degrees of voice in that process, shaped by broader power dynamics in Xinjiang. International researchers sit somewhere off to the side, eager for data, but dependent on permissions they don't control. Is that fair? Is it ideal? Probably not. But it's the landscape in which the science actually happens. The result is that our picture of the Terran people is not just limited by how much ancient DNA survives or how many graves have been found. It's also limited by what's politically and ethically acceptable to touch right now. Some cemeteries remain only lightly documented. Some proposed projects never make it past the permitting stage. Some samples sit unanalyzed because the context around them is too charged. From one angle, that's a loss. Mysteries stay unsolved. Patterns remain blurry. From another angle, it's a reminder that the dead are not just research subjects. They are anchors in living debates about land, identity, and history. And that has a strange side effect. It means the mystery of the Terry mummies is partly self-protecting. The more these bodies are pulled into competing national stories, the more cautious everyone has to be about what gets done to them and what gets said about them. In a way, the ancestors are forcing us to slow down, said. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing, because once you strip away the headlines and the politics, you're left with a quieter, more difficult set of questions. Not just who are they, but what obligation do we have to them? Not just what can their DNA tell us, but what do we owe the people who live on their land now? Those questions don't come with neat, testable answers, but they shape what kind of stories we're able to tell, and what kind we should tell about the dead strangers whose faces stare back at us from the desert. And they set the stage for the last part of this journey. If the Mummies are bound up with modern politics and fragile ethics, what does their story mean for us here and now in a world obsessed with ancestry tests, migration debates, and civilizational bragging rights? What does this desert puzzle really say about who we are? So, let's come back to that big slippery headline claim. Their DNA matched no known population on Earth. By now, you know that's not magic. It doesn't mean space aliens. It doesn't mean a lost race lurking in the desert. What it really means is something both more ordinary and more profound. When scientists compared the Tarim Basin genomes to the reference data they had, the closest matches weren't close enough to say, "Ah, yes, these belong to Group X." The ancestry signals were distinct, and our databases are still incomplete, said. Genetic studies can only compare against what's already been sampled. Modern populations are unevenly represented. Ancient DNA is even patchier. Huge swaths of prehistoric Inner Asia, the high plateaus, the little side valleys along forgotten rivers. No one has pulled DNA from those places yet, or if they have, it hasn't made it into public datasets. So when the early tar mummies don't cluster neatly with known Bronze Age steppe, Honduras, or nearby farmers, that's partly a reflection of their own unusual history, and partly a reflection of the blank spaces on our map. When you zoom out and put all the evidence on the table, a pattern starts to emerge. Archaeology says these people were settled, at least seasonally, around oases that only exist because of a freak arrangement of mountains and rivers. Their cemeteries are carefully planned. Their wooden boats and poles and felt hats show a culture that invested real time and care into rituals. Their textiles draw on techniques seen thousands of kilometers away, yet the overall package, the way clothing, burial, and artifacts fit together, isn't a copy of anywhere else. It's its own thing. The environment says this was always a marginal, high-risk place to live. The Tarim Basin is a rain-shadow desert ringed by glaciers. If you get the irrigation wrong, your fields vanish. If a river shifts course, an oasis dies, said. That kind of landscape favors tight social cohesion, deep local knowledge, and a stubborn commitment to staying put. You don't stumble into a place like that. You adapt to it over generations. The genetics say the earliest Taran people carry a heavy dose of ancestry from an old, deeply drifted Inner Asian lineage, one that ties back loosely to those ancient Ice Age populations we talked about earlier, but doesn't match any single later group. On top of that, as time goes on, you see trickles of ancestry from steppe herders, from farming cultures, to the east and west, from neighboring valleys. Not a clean replacement, more like layers of influence settling on a persistent local base. Put those threads together, and the most plausible big picture looks less like mysterious intruders and more like a unique community at a crossroads. Imagine a population with very deep regional roots in the broader Inner Asian world. They survive climatic swings. They learn the local hydrology inside out. And when mobile herders and travelers begin to move along the Proto-Silk Road corridors, they're already there anchored to the water. They trade. They borrow textile patterns, food crops, maybe even bits of language and myth. They bury their dead with objects that speak of faraway contacts, but they don't dissolve into the passing waves. They stay themselves over centuries, said. That creates exactly the kind of genetic and cultural signature we see in the Tar Basin. Distinctive, internally coherent, but with fingerprints from multiple neighbors. In other words, the mystery isn't that they had no relatives, it's that they remind us how much human history we've lost track of. For every famous empire, there were dozens of oasis communities, riverine enclaves, mountain valleys with their own experiments in how to be human. The Tar Mummies are one of the few that the desert happened to preserve. Could this story change? Absolutely. More genomes from more cemeteries could show that what we're calling tear in people actually masks several related but distinct groups, each with its own ancestry mix. Better radiocarbon dates could tighten the timeline, showing exactly where new ancestry components appear and how that lines up with climate shifts or the rise of long-distance trade. Sampling from surrounding regions, those little side oases, the high pastures, the early towns on the edges of the desert, could reveal the missing cousin populations that would make the term genetic profile suddenly look a lot less lonely. A single grave in some unexavated valley in Kyrgyzstan or Western China could hold a person whose DNA bridges the gap between the ancient inner Asian lineage and later steppe groups. A forgotten archive of textiles could show a design lineage that connect Tarim weaving to a yet unsampled culture farther west. A new inscription or a hoard of wooden tablets might finally give us more than a whisper of their own words. Every one of those finds would sand down the edges of the mystery. They'd turn no known population into, oh, of course that's where they fit. But even when the tree of connections is fully sketched in, one thing will probably remain. The lesson that populations don't have to be simple to be real. You can be rooted in one place for millennia and still be shaped by exchanges that span continents. You can be both local and global, both of the desert and part of something much larger. And that matters now in a world obsessed with ancestry tests, purity myths, and neat ethnic boxes. When a commercial DNA report tells you you're 23% this and 12% that, it's tempting to imagine tidy branches and clear-cut origins. The tar mummies quietly blow that up. They show us that real human histories are messy. They involve bottlenecks, blind alleys, ghost lineages that leave only a faint trace in our genomes. They involve people holding on to their own ways of life while constantly negotiating with outsiders, neighbors, and newcomers. They also remind us that we is always bigger than we think. The farmers and city dwellers who would one day send caravans across the Silk Road depended on the knowledge of desert specialists like the Tarim communities. People whose names we don't know, whose languages we can't hear, but whose choices shaped the networks that eventually tied Eurasia together. So, where does that leave us? With an unfinished story, a set of faces looking out of the sand, asking questions we can't fully answer yet. A genetic signal that says, we were here, we mattered. But your categories aren't quite big enough to fit us. I'm curious what you make of them. Do you lean towards seeing the tar people as long-rooted locals, as refugees from some older catastrophe, as skilled intermediaries at a crossroads, or something else entirely? And where are you listening from as you think about that desert, those graves, and what ancestry really means in your own life? Let me know your theory in the comments, and tell me what part of the world you're watching from. If you want to dive deeper into these kinds of prehistoric puzzles, the bottlenecks, the ghost populations, the forgotten experiments in being human, I've written a whole book about these secrets of deep time. You can read more about it and grab a copy at sleepattimehistory.com. If you found this journey through the Taran Basin thought-provoking, it really helps if you like the video. Drop a comment and subscribe so you don't miss what we explore next. Good night.